From plastic gleaming under fluorescent light to mist hanging over a black river. From a ritual knife laid out on a stainless steel tray to a muddy boot print beside a numbered crime scene marker in the Washington woods. One man stages his violence like a movie. The other disappears his in the rain. Let's kick things off in split screen. Left side, Dexter's world. Clear plastic wrapped tight over a kill table. Blue tape perfectly aligned. Duct tape strips pre-cut, syringe ready. Right side, a faded pickup truck rolling down Pacific Highway South. Sodium lights streaking across the windshield as it turns toward the Green River. No plastic, no code. Just a truck, a back road, a riverbank. We cut faster. Dexter's gloved hands arranging blood slides in a neat row. A scalpel catching the light. A drain grate swallowing diluted red. Smash 2. Search parties sweeping through wet underbrush. Orange vests and flashlights. Detectives staring at flagged bones, half buried in moss. One side is obsessed with control and aesthetic. The other is defined by absence, by how long it took anyone to even see what was piling up out there. In this video, we're going to live inside that contrast, not to crown a cooler killer, but to feel how far Dexter's fantasy really is from Gary Ridgway's reality. Because while Dexter spends an entire season crafting a single perfect plan, Ridgway confessed to at least 71 murders, convicted of 49, using a pattern so brutally simple, it almost breaks our sense of how an investigation is supposed to work. To keep this clear, the montage doesn't explain yet. It just shows the paradox. Dexter builds an entire psychology around ritual. Stalk, test, prepare the room. Ridgway picks up a woman, drives, kills quickly, dumps the body in woods or water. No slides, no trophies, no cinematic signature. And yet, which man actually survived decades of real police work pressing in around him? Now the near discoveries collide. Dokes flicking through Dexter's blood slide box, eyes narrowing. Lila stepping into the cabin, flames blooming as she solves Dexter's problem by erasing a body. Deb pushing open a plastic curtain, staring at her brother mid-kill. Cut, hard, to Ridgway, sitting in an interview room, hands folded, calmly answering detectives' questions. The polygraph machine ticks, the needle glides. He passes. He walks out. The investigation resets while he keeps driving back to the river. The focus is not just on style, but on consequences. Dexter's slightest mistake triggers a season-long collapse. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force, La Guerta, in that shipping container, Iron Lake closing in. Ridgway, by contrast, moves through a world that keeps failing around him. Technology lags, agencies miscommunicate, vulnerable women remain invisible. We end on 2 final images. Dexter reverently sliding a new blood slide into its wooden box, sealing his illusion of control for one more night. Ridgway's truck cresting a hill at dusk, the Green River fading in the rear view, the passenger seat empty, radio low. One of these men needs a perfect plan to survive. The other survived because the world itself kept missing him. The central question is, what happens when we finally put them side by side and watch Dexter's myth crack? So let's kick things off by dropping the blunt version of this matchup. If Dexter Morgan had been operating in the Green River Killer's world, his story would have collapsed in a handful of episodes. Not a decade-long saga, not 2 shows and a revival. A brief, messy arc ending with a mugshot and a very confused Miami PD. In this video, we're going to treat that as more than a spicy take. The central question is not who has the higher body count, because Ridgway wins that on raw numbers before the opening credits roll. We're asking, whose plans, safeguards, and mistakes could actually survive prolonged contact with real investigations, evolving forensics, and institutions that are not written to look the other way? To keep this clear, we need to contrast the fantasy and the reality. Dexter imagines himself as a meticulous, code-driven predator. Plastic-wrapped kill rooms, blood slides labeled like trophies, elaborate stalking phases where he verifies guilt and scripts every beat. His psychology is built around control. If the plan is perfect, the monster is contained. Ridgeway is the opposite of that mythology. No code, almost no ritual. A truck, a stretch of highway near Seattle and Tacoma, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable women who the system already refused to protect. He confessed to 71 murders, was convicted of 49, and operated for roughly 16 years. Not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because he was unremarkable enough to blend into the background noise of a failing investigation. And that's where Dexter's myth really starts to crack. On TV, we're told he is always 10 steps ahead. But when we track his trajectory season by season, what actually happens? Plans fail constantly. He loses blood slides. He misjudges people like Dokes, Lila, Miguel. He underestimates investigations like the Bay Harbor Butcher case, which literally grows out of the evidence he lovingly organizes. Again and again, the only reason these failures don't end the series is because the fictional Miami PD is forgiving, distracted, or conveniently incompetent. Now put that same character into a Green River level environment, an investigation that spans years, task forces cycling through suspects, Ridgeway being questioned, swabbed, even polygraphed in 1984, and still slipping away. This is a world where investigators miss real killers, not where they politely ignore a forensics tech whose hobbies include boat trips at midnight and a suspicious number of closed cases. Dexter can't even keep a single blood slide from ending up in Dokes' hands. How long do we think his elaborate ritual rooms and harbor dumps would last under the kind of pressure that eventually weaponized DNA against Ridgeway? The focus is not just on the kills themselves, it's on how each man survives his own mistakes. Ridgeway passes a polygraph while actively hunting. Dexter nearly implodes when Rita finds a syringe. One lives because the world keeps failing. The other lives because the writing keeps forgiving. Along the way, that's the verdict we're moving toward. Dexter's universe is engineered to let him keep killing. Ridgeway endured in a universe that was genuinely trying and failing to stop him. Next, we're going to zoom in on the specific safeguards each man trusted and watch how quickly Dexter's collapse once we strip away the plot armor. So now we flip the lens. Instead of asking how Dexter keeps getting away with it, we start asking how close he is to losing everything in almost every season, every major plan, every supposedly controlled situation. Let's kick things off with that mental rewatch. Picture Season 1, not as the rise of a careful predator, but as a man who nearly exposes himself every time he acts. The blood slide box Rita's kids find. The ice truck killer leaving body parts like a personalized scavenger hunt. Dokes watching Dexter's every move on pure instinct. If we pause on each of those beats, the central question is no longer, how did he escape? But why didn't this collapse the whole investigation right here? To keep this clear, in this video, we're going to treat every big Dexter plan as a case study in miscalculation. The plan to keep trophies in his air conditioner. The plan to use the same plastic-wrapped kill rooms over and over. The plan to dump bodies in the same stretch of ocean, stalk the target, prepare the room, control the scene. On paper, it looks meticulous. In practice, it creates a pattern any Green River level task force would map in red string by mid-season. Think about the recurring collapse points. Trophies discovered, Dokes with the slides, Miguel finding out what Dexter really is, Harrison literally sitting in a pool of Rita's blood because Dexter misread Trinity's psychology. Kill rooms interrupted, Deb walking into the church as Dexter kills Travis, Lila showing up at the cabin, Saxon turning the tables in that hospital room, victims escaping, the dentist in New Blood, the guy who runs from the kill table in Season 2, even Trinity walking away from what Dexter assumes is a clean takedown. Each oops is not a quirky twist, it's operational failure with lethal consequences. And the code? Harry sells it as protection, a system, a safeguard. But a real investigation hunts systems. Dexter's insistence on only killing certain targets, wrapping them the same way, cutting them the same way, talking to them the same way, before the knife comes down, that's ritual, not camouflage. The focus is not just on what he does, but how repeatable it is. A Ridgway task force would turn that code into a profile, then into a search pattern, then into a net. Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway survives precisely because he does not perform this elaborate theater. No plastic cathedrals, no trophies, in a box, a truck, a victim, a secluded spot, a dump site that shifts over years. He passes a polygraph. While already a suspect, Dexter can't even keep a single blood slide out of the wrong hands. Along the way, we start to see the deeper twist. The more Dexter chases control, the more fragile he becomes. Every new rule, every new relationship, every new contingency plan adds another point of failure. Ridgway's chaos makes him blurry. Dexter's order makes him visible. And in the next section, we're going to follow that visibility, season by season, until one specific failure makes it impossible to pretend he was ever a mastermind at all. Ridgway's chaos makes him blurry. Dexter's order makes him visible. So, before we throw them in the same ring, we need to be precise about what we're actually comparing here and what we're not. We're not running a moral scoreboard. This isn't a contest over who is worse. Gary Ridgway confessed to 71 murders and was convicted of 49. Dexter is a fictional vigilante whose body count exists inside a writer's room. The central question for us is structural. How does a television control fantasy stack up against a real opportunistic predator operating inside a hostile, evolving investigation that actually wants him dead or in prison? To keep this clear, we're going to narrow the frame. We're not dissecting every subplot in Dexter or every legal maneuver in the Green River case. We're looking at plans, investigative pressure, and survival tactics. How Dexter's rituals function inside Miami Metro's bubble. How Ridgway's habits played against the Seattle and Tacoma task forces that questioned him, polygraphed him, cleared him, and then watched the bodies keep turning up anyway. In this video, we're going to use a simple template for both men. Plan anatomy, intention, method, safeguards, exposure points. What did they think they were doing? How did they do it? What was supposed to keep them safe? And where, under real forensic scrutiny, would that structure crack? Dexter's plastic-wrapped kill rooms, his blood slides, his ocean dumps. Ridgway's truck, his chosen hunting grounds along Pacific Highway South. His quick strangulations and remote body dumps in woods and ravines. Along the way, we'll keep three recurring dynamics in Dexter's planning front and center. First, his overconfidence in the code as a shield, as if Harry's rules somehow bend the laws of evidence and probability. Second, his hunger for connection that repeatedly overrides caution, from Brian and Lila to Miguel, Lumen, Hannah, even Harrison. Third, his chronic underestimation of other people's intelligence, whether that's Dokes's instincts, Lundy's pattern recognition, or Deborah's ability to see what's right in front of her. How many times does he assume they'll never put this together right before someone does? For Ridgway, we're going to strip away the TV mythology and focus on four blunt elements: victim selection, body disposal, interaction with police, and the systemic blind spots that functioned as his accidental code of survival. He targeted vulnerable women and sex workers, picked them up in a truck, killed them fast, and left them in places the world was already ignoring. He passed a 1984 polygraph while under suspicion and used that institutional failure as cover he didn't even have to understand. The focus is not just on who killed more, but on how their trajectories depended on the environments around them. What happens when Dexter's meticulous plans are dropped into a green river level investigation? What happens when Ridgway's crude methods are given Dexter's forensic spotlight? Each major section will stress test those plan anatomies against real pressure until one comparison makes Dexter's entire illusion of control look paper thin. So, to keep this clear, we need a simple way to name the different ways Dexter's life falls apart. Not every failure is the same kind of collapse. Some are about bad logistics, some are about people, and some are about Dexter trying to escape himself. Let's kick things off with the most obvious layer: operational failures. These are the concrete mistakes in planning and execution. The moments where the perfect plan springs a leak, wrong timing, sloppy disposal, overlooked evidence that turns into an investigation. When Dexter misreads Dokes' schedule and ends up locked in a cabin with him, that's not the code failing. That's operational failure. When a single blood slide goes missing and Lagerta starts quietly connecting Bay Harbor butcher patterns, Dexter's ritual itself becomes the evidence trail. Even the ocean dumps, his signature solution, generate a literal graveyard that Devers can find. The central question here is simple. How many times can a meticulous killer survive this many logistical errors in a real Green River level case? Relational failures cut deeper. These are the collapses that come from Dexter's need for connection, approval, or emotional cover. He tells us he can't feel, but his worst decisions are driven by relationships. Rita gives him a family fantasy that anchors his cover, but also locks him into routines he can't control. Lumen pulls him into a vigilante partnership where he starts sharing methods, emotions, and risk with someone outside the code. Hannah becomes a romantic exception that tempts him to believe he can merge intimacy with predation. And Deb is the fault line running through every season, from trusting Big Brother cop to horrified witness in the church. Each step in their bond pushes Dexter into riskier lies, riskier kills, and finally, shared murder. How many of Dexter's near exposures exist only because he couldn't keep people at arm's length? Then there are the existential failures, where Dexter tries to change his nature outright. These aren't just bad nights. These are bad reinventions. When he promises Rita He can be a husband and father first, the dark passenger second. The pressure only drives him to more frantic kills. When he runs away with Lumen's mission, then later dreams of disappearing with Hannah and Harrison. Each new life requires new lies, new identities, and new vulnerabilities. New Blood is one long existential failure. Iron Lake, Jim Lindsay, is a plan to quit killing that implodes the second he breaks his own rules and draws a whole town's suspicion. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to these 3 layers. Each major section will track how a single plan fails operationally, relationally, and existentially. Then, ask what would happen if you dropped that same plan into Gary Ridgway's world. Because Ridgway's planning rarely fails in these categories. It barely exists. He relies on environment, victim vulnerability, and investigative blind spots, not elaborate rituals. Along the way, we'll see why Dexter needs to be a mastermind just to survive a fictional Miami, while Ridgway could be frighteningly ordinary and still kill for decades. So, to keep this clear, let's kick things off by laying out the path we're going to walk Dexter down. We're moving straight through his life in order, from season 1 all the way to New Blood, and at each stop we're going to anchor him to 1, 2, maybe 3 defining plans that permanently bend his trajectory. Not every kill, not every case. Only the schemes that change who he is and who pays the price. In this video, we're going to treat each of those plans like a full case file. First, intention. What Dexter thinks he's doing, the fantasy of control he's chasing, whether that's purifying Miami or building a safe family around his darkness. Then, safeguards. The code, the rituals, the forensics tricks, the people he leans on as human shields. After that, the breaking point, the exact scene where reality punctures the plan. And finally, fallout, the operational mess, the relational damage, and the existential crack that opens underneath him. Each major section will end with the same test. Would this plan survive if Dexter was operating under a Green River level task force? Would it last a month against detectives who are expanding resources, re-interviewing suspects, and quietly building DNA databases? Or would it collapse the first time someone like Gary Ridgway gets polygraphed and still walks free, while investigators keep coming back? Along the way, we'll weave in the real Green River investigation milestones as a kind of counterpoint timeline. When season 1 gives us Dexter smugly cataloging blood-slides, we'll place that next to the early 1980s, when Ridgway is already dumping bodies around the Green River, and the investigation is still struggling to even define a pattern. When Dexter survives scrutiny at Miami Metro, we'll cut to 1984, when Ridgway sits for a polygraph as an active suspect, passes, and keeps killing. As Dexter's world gets more complex, the real task force does too. We'll track the late 1990s DNA breakthroughs that finally link Ridgway to victims against Dexter's own forensic blind spots. We'll watch the Green River Task Force expand, consolidate, and adapt, while Dexter keeps recycling the same code and the same rituals, convinced the investigation will never catch up to his psychology. The stakes will escalate season by season. Early on, his failures are mostly operational. Bodies found, patterns noticed, dokes circling. The Bay Harbor Butcher case, literally built from the trophies Dexter thought made him untouchable. Later, the failures become relational. Lila, Miguel, Lumen, Rita, Deb, Harrison. Plans to protect people become the very engines of their destruction. By the time we reach New Blood, the failures are existential. Every attempt to quit, to rebrand, to start over in Iron Lake only exposes how little control he ever had. By the end, the central question won't be, could Dexter beat Ridgway in a fair fight between masterminds? It will be, how did we ever believe this man was in control at all, when a real investigation like Green River would have shredded his life by season 2? And the first cracks in that illusion start earlier than most fans remember. So, before we throw Dexter into a hypothetical Green River investigation and watch him collapse by episode 3, we need to hit pause on the matchup itself. The real pattern here isn't Dexter versus Ridgway. It's fantasy versus reality. It's the myth of the genius serial killer versus what most serial killers actually are. TV has trained us to expect masterminds, plastic-wrapped temples to control, elaborate rituals, coded trophies, a psychology so rarefied only one tortured detective can decode it. In this video, we're going to step outside that frame for a second, because the central question isn't who's smarter. It's why do we keep assuming serial killer means criminal mastermind in the first place? To keep this clear, let's look at Gary Ridgway on paper, not as a boogeyman, as a person. He was a truck painter in Washington. Average IQ, lived a mundane life in the suburbs. Married multiple times, went to work, complained about money, mowed his lawn. No secret lab, no meticulous code, no plastic-wrapped kill rooms hidden in a Miami condo. His method? He picked up vulnerable women along Pacific Highway South, killed them quickly, and dumped their bodies in remote or wooded areas. That's it. No cat-and-mouse theatrics, no elaborate staging. For nearly 2 decades, one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history operated with a plan that was less 4D chess and more, no one is really looking at me. And here's the brutal part. The Green River investigation didn't fail because Ridgway was some Dexter-level tactician. It failed because the systems around him were cracked. Under-resourced detectives drowning in caseloads. Victims who were sex workers and runaways, pushed to the margins and treated as disposable. Forensics that, in the early 80s, simply couldn't do what late 90s DNA eventually did. Ridgway was questioned. He was an early suspect. He even passed a polygraph while he was actively killing. That wasn't his genius. That was institutional failure. When DNA finally caught up and linked him to multiple victims, nothing about his process had suddenly gotten smarter. The world around him had finally started working. Now, hold that next to Dexter, our fictional perfect predator whose entire identity rests on the idea that, with enough planning and the right code, one man can outthink an entire city indefinitely. The focus is not just on his kills, but on the fantasy that control is a skill you can grind to max level if you're disciplined enough. Dexter's world has to believe in the mastermind myth for the show to function. Cops miss what's in front of them. Forensics bend around his routines. Consequences delay themselves until the season finale. Each major section will keep showing how that scaffolding erodes, but the seed is right here. The premise itself is a lie, and as we move into season 1, we'll watch that lie fracture every time Dexter's perfect plan hits something Ridgway never tried to control at all. Human unpredictability. People who don't follow the script. Victims who fight back. Colleagues who notice patterns, family members who walk in one scene too early. Ridgway exploited chaos by blending into it. Dexter tries to dominate chaos with ritual and rules, which approach actually survives a real investigation. That's where we're heading next, starting with the ice truck killer ripping open Dexter's illusion of control from day one. Ridgway thrives in noise. Dexter needs a stage. Season 1 drops us into a system that looks airtight. Stalk the target. Confirm the victims. Prepare the kill room. Dexter's operating system is Harry's code translated into logistics. Exhaustive victim. Vetting. A confession carved out with plastic wrap and duct tape. A single controlled stab to the heart. Then neat ocean disposal and a blood slide trophy filed away like a dark little lab result. On paper, this is what control looks like. But to keep this clear, that elegance is also evidence. Every kill room is an improvised forensic studio. Wall-to-wall plastic sheeting, custom restraints, carefully laid tools. Dexter swabs his victims, confronts them with photos, forces a narrative. He doesn't just remove a threat, he stages a thesis about himself. The blood slides are the purest expression of that psychology. Tiny, fragile, meticulously labeled, proof that he did it right. Now we drop that fantasy into the early 1980s Pacific Northwest. Gary Ridgway is cruising Pacific Highway South in a beat-up truck. He picks up sex workers and vulnerable women, often on the same strips police are already watching. He kills fast, usually in or near the vehicle, sometimes strangling them within minutes. No speeches, no plastic, no trophies, lined up under an air conditioner. Then he dumps bodies in rivers, ravines, or wooded clusters that blend into the landscape. The central question: which method actually survives a green river? Level investigation. Ridgway's pattern is opportunistic, low ritual, and deliberately messy. He doesn't need a code. He needs availability, privacy, and time. The kill room is whatever space he can control for 10 minutes. The body dump is whatever remote patch he can reach before anyone looks in the passenger seat. Dexter, by contrast, is ritual-heavy and evidence-rich. A consistent disposal site in the same stretch of ocean. A repeating signature with the blood slides. Elaborate prep that requires transport, time, and locations that can be mapped. In a world where investigators are already learning from the Green River case, that's a behavioral profile begging to be drawn. Multiple missing offenders with criminal histories vanish, and their last common link is a Miami forensic analyst whose cases often end in unknown offender, presumed dead. That's not invisible, that's a pattern. Ridgway was questioned, polygraphed, and still walked away. Dexter can't even hide a single box of trophies from Dokes. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between appearance and survivability. The focus is not just on how cleverly Dexter kills, but on how loudly he advertises that a single mind is orchestrating these disappearances. And Season 1 immediately stresses that system. While Ridgway never has to fight a psychological duel with a rival killer, Dexter opens his trajectory, playing a dual front war. Maintain the routine of Harry's code, while the ice truck killer studies, mirrors, and mocks that routine from the shadows. Each major section will track how that plan to handle both starts cracking the moment another predator enters his carefully curated world. So when Dexter decides he can handle both, the ice truck killer and his usual hunting, we're watching the first big stress test of his supposed control. This is where the fantasy of the meticulous vigilante collides with an opponent who understands his psychology better than he does. The central question isn't just whether Dexter can catch this killer, it's whether his entire operating plan can survive being treated as a game. Dexter's intention is deceptively simple. Keep the routine. Maintain Harry's code, hit his own targets, clock in at Miami Metro. And on top of that, treat the ice truck killer as a kind of personal puzzle and secret admirer. He reads the early crime scenes as tributes, as winks only he can decode. And he assumes he has the bandwidth to juggle both trajectories without real consequences. In his mind, this isn't overreach. It's proof he's special. To keep this clear, we can lay out the safeguards he thinks he has. First, proximity to the investigation. Working inside Miami Metro gives him access to evidence, timelines, and internal chatter. Second, insulation of identity. The blood slide trophies are hidden, the kill rooms vanish, the ocean takes the bodies. Third, he assumes his opponent plays by the same rules of theatricality and secrecy, that this is a private duel between two artists who both need the curtain to stay up. As long as everyone keeps playing, Dexter believes the system won't see him. But the ice truck killer immediately attacks those assumptions. Staged body parts that reference Dexter's childhood. The decapitated Barbie left in his freezer. The refrigerated truck intersecting directly with his professional life. Each move drags the game out of Dexter's private fantasy space and into documented reality. Suddenly, the secret admirer is leaving evidence chains, crime scene photos, witness statements, things that don't care about Dexter's narrative. And once that happens, Dexter stops being proactive and starts chasing. He rushes to crime scenes, bends protocol, accesses files he shouldn't, inserts himself into leads to keep the puzzle close. In a real major case squad, those behaviors would light up an audit trail, badge swipes, database logs, deviations from procedure, all of it forming a pattern of one forensic tech consistently orbiting the hottest investigation in the city. The plan to stay invisible collapses the second he has to move on someone else's timetable. Contrast that with Gary Ridgway. Ridgway never played games with police, never left taunting messages, never turned his killings into a dialogue. No Barbie dolls, no refrigerated theater. By refusing theatrics, he denied investigators the very psychological leverage the ice truck killer immediately exploits in Dexter. Ridgway's plan was brutal minimalism. A truck, free time, vulnerable victims, and dump sites that blended into the landscape. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap. Dexter keeps choosing elaborate, emotionally charged battles that generate paper, witnesses, and pressure. Ridgway survived by giving the investigation almost nothing to work with. So what happens when Dexter's next opponent doesn't want to play at all, and the only game left is the one law enforcement is running on him? So let's kick things off with the image Dexter loves most. That sleek boat cutting across a black Miami bay. Garbage bags lined up like obedient secrets at his feet. Dismemberment first. Careful drainage. Plastic on every surface. The body turned into labeled components of a plan. Then the double bagging. The nighttime launch. And the quiet ritual of dropping weighted parcels into the same dark, comforting patch of ocean. It feels controlled. It feels scientific. In Dexter's psychology, that offshore zone becomes a private cemetery and a pressure valve, a place where the code and the fantasy of perfect disposal meet. Stalk the target, prepare the kill room, feed the sea. Every step is designed to erase the evidence trail and keep the investigation blind. Until it doesn't, the show gives us the exact nightmare scenario that any real task force would be gaming out on day one. A diver looking for something else, a current shift that moves just a few bags off the invisible boundary Dexter has been trusting for years. Suddenly, the ocean doesn't look like oblivion. It looks like a mass graveyard, with dozens of bodies surfacing into a single, unified crime scene. From a forensic perspective, that's catastrophic. One discovery collapses years of murders into a single data point. There is a serial killer. He has a pattern, and he has been using this zone as infrastructure. In this video, we're going to keep stressing this. Dexter's greatest comfort is also a giant red circle on the map the moment anything goes wrong. Now, contrast that with Gary Ridgway. No boat, no ritual dismemberment, no consistent offshore dump. He uses multiple sites along rivers, wooded areas, and remote stretches off Pacific Highway South. Bodies left in shallow water, under brush, in clusters that share a general region but not a clean geometric center. Sometimes he revisits them. Sometimes he moves remains. Sometimes he just doesn't. On the surface, that looks sloppy, even reckless. But to keep this clear, the focus is not just on neatness. It's on what kind of pattern an investigation can actually model. Ridgway's geography is chaotic. Different dump sites, different levels of exposure, different timelines of discovery. Each cluster hints at organization, then dissolves into noise when you zoom out. Dexter's ocean cemetery is elegant. Ridgway's riverbanks are messy. Which one gives a green river level task force more control? The uncomfortable answer is that Ridgway's mess kept detectives chasing partial truths for decades, while one compromised bag nearly ends Dexter's entire trajectory in a single season. So, the central question hanging over Dexter's fantasy is this. In a world of evolving forensics, sonar, side scan surveys, and dedicated serial killer units, how long does a single, consistent ocean dump site really stay invisible? And if the water turns against him, what exactly does Dexter have left? And Season 1 answers that question brutally fast. One scuba team drops into Dexter's personal graveyard, and in a single afternoon, his entire illusion of control is dragged to the surface. Black trash bags bobbing in the current, dismembered torsos laid out under white tents, news vans circling the marina, while Miami basks in that sick, televised glow of a serial killer at large. This is not a slow burn. This is a spotlight. Inside Miami Metro, we watch the pressure spike in real time. LaGuerta chasing camera angles, Matthews demanding progress, Dokes prowling the bullpen, reading every hesitation as guilt. The investigation locks onto the ocean dump site as a forensic gold mine, and Dexter is suddenly ring-fenced by the very machinery he thought he'd mastered. The lab, the docks, the morgue, the press conferences, every space he moves through is now organized around finding him. To keep this clear, look at Dexter's response. He doesn't go cold and methodical. He panics. He sneaks out to his boat. He destroys evidence. He changes disposal routines mid-investigation. He improvises new plans on the fly, not because the code tells him to, but because his psychology has been built on the fantasy that he can always stay one step ahead. The more the net tightens, the more erratic he becomes. Now, put that next to Gary Ridgway in 1984. Real world. No narrative protection. He's brought in as a Green River suspect, directly questioned, hooked up to a polygraph. This is the moment. TV logic tells us the monster slips. Instead, Ridgway passes the test, walks out the door, and keeps killing for years. Same category of pressure, formal suspicion, active investigation, but a completely different survival pattern. He doesn't overhaul his life. He doesn't reinvent his dump sites overnight. He just keeps his head down and benefits from institutional failure. That contrast is the point. Dexter, the fictional mastermind, almost collapses the first time the system glances in his direction. Ridgway, the blue-collar truck painter with average intelligence, survives direct contact with detectives and a lie detector because the chaos around him does more work than he does, and Dexter's day job actually makes him more exposed. As a blood spatter analyst, he lives inside the evidence stream. Coworkers watch his reactions. Command staff tracks his movements. Every new body, every lab report, every task force meeting is another chance for someone like Dokes to notice what doesn't fit. Ridgway clocked in, painted trucks, and went home. No daily briefings on his own crimes, no constant forensic spotlight. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this asymmetry. Season 1 already proves the thesis. Dexter's perfect system is one diver, one current shift, one curious cop away from total collapse, while Ridgway's messy, opportunistic trajectory survives a polygraph and walks back into the night. So, when the divers hit that garbage bag at the bottom of the bay, we watch Dexter's fantasy world collide with something closer to Green River reality. One body bag becomes two, then a field of black plastic rising through the water. The ocean is no longer a bottomless delete key. It's a crime scene. Miami wakes up with a headline: a mass grave in its backyard, a serial killer with a calling card, and suddenly the Bay Harbor butcher has a task force, a press conference, and the FBI flying in. This is the first time Dexter faces anything resembling the institutional pressure that hunted Gary Ridgway. Interagency cooperation, daily briefings, forensic cross-checks, and a media cycle that will not shut up. The central question becomes painfully simple. What happens to Dexter's plan when the system actually sees him as a problem to solve, not a technician to trust? To keep this clear, Season 2 is the purest stress test of his methods. In Season 1, he was ahead of the investigation. Here, he is the investigation. His blood slides are now evidence categories. His dump site is a grid. His careful dismemberments invite FBI profilers to reconstruct his psychology, his code, his trajectory. The focus is not just on whether they can name him, but on how quickly his supposed safeguards turn into a roadmap. Dexter's response is to do what he always does: make a new plan and assume he can control every variable. He decides to manipulate the investigation from the inside, steer Lundy's task force, nudge Masuka's forensics, and redirect suspicion toward convenient scapegoats. At the same time, he tries to ration his urges, spacing out kills, choosing low-risk targets, telling himself that temporary restraint equals long-term safety. On paper, it sounds precise. In practice, it's a man trying to rewrite the rules of gravity mid-fall. And then there's Dokes. This is where the operational crisis mutates into a relational one. Ridgway survived waves of detectives who only knew him as a name in a file. Dexter has a sergeant who knows him as a liar in the next cubicle. Dokes doesn't just suspect a killer in Miami, he suspects Dexter specifically, and he follows that instinct past protocol, past professionalism, into outright stalking. Every move Dexter makes to protect the investigation from seeing him only convinces Dokes he's hiding something. Along the way, we watch his pillars of control start to buckle. His job stops being a shield and becomes a spotlight. His code, already ethically bankrupt, forces him into riskier decisions just to maintain the illusion that he's different from the butcher they're hunting. His isolation fails as Deb, Rita, and even Lundy get pulled into the blast radius of the Bay Harbor investigation. Season 2 asks the question Dexter never wants to face. What if the world takes him as seriously as he takes himself? In the next section, we'll track, step by step, how every safeguard he trusts, every contingency he thinks will save him, doesn't just fail, but actively accelerates his collapse. Season 2 leaves Dexter ringed by boats, divers, and federal agents, yet he still believes he can choreograph the investigation hunting him. That illusion of control is the bridge to our comparison, because where Dexter leans in and tries to steer the narrative, Gary Ridgway survives by almost never touching it at all. Let's kick things off with Dexter's intention. Embedded inside the task force, he doesn't just want to avoid suspicion, he wants to curate the investigation. Feed Masuka and Lundy just enough evidence to keep the Bay Harbor butcher abstract, distant, and conveniently incompatible with the quiet blood guy in the lab. Maintain access to crime scenes, databases, and case files, while quietly pruning any trail that leads back to his slides, his marina, his code. To keep this clear, look at the tactics. He stages crime scenes to look like someone else's work, alters blood spatter interpretations to suggest different angles, different weapons, different heights. He loses or downplays anomalous traces that might connect multiple dump sites. He nudges Deb toward other suspects, lets Lagerta chase political ghosts, frames Dokes with the cabin and the dismembered bodies. Every move is a small editorial decision on reality. This counts as evidence that gets buried, but every intervention is also a new fault line. An altered report is a permanent record of his interference. Inconsistent behavior around key scenes, too eager here, strangely detached there, creates a pattern of anomalies that a serious internal affairs review could map. Imagine a Green River style long-term task force with analysts revisiting old files every few years. Those selective interpretations, those missing samples, those oddly convenient conclusions, they would light up under a cold case audit. This is where Ridgway's low profile becomes terrifying. While Dexter is inside the investigation trying to sculpt it, Ridgway is outside doing almost nothing theatrical. No taunting calls, no coded letters, no elaborate plastic-wrapped kill rooms. He uses his truck, secluded roads, wooded dump sites. He talks to police when he has to, passes a polygraph once, then recedes back into the blur of working-class Seattle. He doesn't try to shape the story. He survives by not being a character in it. The central question is which psychology actually endures pressure. Dexter's plan depends on everyone else behaving predictably. Ridgway's plan is the absence of one. Minimal contact, minimal records, minimal performance. In a decades-long Green River investigation, Dexter's fingerprints would be all over the case file, literally and metaphorically. Each major section of the task force's timeline would show his name attached to key misdirections. Along the way, technology advances, new detectives rotate in, and fresh eyes ask, why did this one analyst keep steering us away from the right questions? That's the pattern we'll follow next. How a task force that keeps coming back eventually catches the man who won't stop editing his own investigation. So, when we zoom in on Dexter's Bay Harbor endgame, we're not just looking at a close call. We're watching a fantasy of evasion that only works because the world around him is built to cooperate. To keep this clear, we need to walk through the plan that turns James Dokes from relentless investigator into sacrificial decoy. Dexter's Season 2 solution is brutally simple on the surface. Kidnap Dokes, imprison him in a remote cabin, plant the blood slides and dismemberment tools, then wait for the investigation to discover the perfect Bay Harbor butcher. He's not just hiding evidence, he's redirecting the entire narrative of the case onto one man and trusting that once the story fits, the system will stop asking questions. And crucially, he intends to let external forces finish the job, whether that means the task force, the cartel, or fate. But look at the operational insanity underneath that calm narration. He's holding a highly trained cop hostage, a man whose last known obsession is Dexter himself. He's maintaining a secret cabin, restocking food and supplies, moving in and out of the Everglades while the largest investigation of his career is unfolding around him. Then, when the plan starts to wobble, he outsources the final catastrophic step to Lila, a volatile outsider with no code, no loyalty, and her own unstable psychology. What level of control is that, really? In a real Bay Harbor scale investigation, Dokes disappearing mid-hunt would be a 5-alarm fire. His phone records, GPS data, last surveillance logs, and every cop he spoke to about Dexter would be pulled apart. Internal affairs would swarm his cases. The FBI would likely be looped in the moment a decorated sergeant goes missing while circling a serial killer. Any trace of Dexter at that cabin, fibers, hair, tool marks, tire impressions, even his purchase history for that cabin itself, would become part of a massive, multi-agency investigation. Does anyone believe a blood spatter analyst who keeps popping up on the periphery walks away clean from that kind of scrutiny? Now, contrast that with Gary Ridgway. The Green River Killer doesn't need to frame anyone. He doesn't have a Dokes to neutralize because the system misdirects itself. He's questioned, polygraphed, even flagged as suspicious, and still the investigation drifts away on its own biases and blind spots. No plastic-wrapped kill rooms, no elaborate scapegoats, just a man who benefits from institutional failure rather than having to manufacture it. And that's where the ethical question cuts through the fiction. Dexter's narrative asks us to accept Dokes' death as a tragic necessity, the price of protecting a better killer. But the Green River case shows what happens when systems mislabel the wrong man in reality. Innocent people are harassed, real predators keep killing, and the investigation's trajectory bends away from justice for years. If we cheer when a story makes the wrong man fit, what are we training ourselves to ignore the next time a real task force starts to look in the wrong direction? In this video, we're going to keep pressing on that discomfort because the next phase of Dexter's life takes this same evasive logic and tries to turn it into a family plan. So let's kick things off by doing what Dexter's own world almost never does. Let's imagine the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation not as a single chaotic season of television, but as a Green River style cold case that refuses to die. 10, 20 years out, new forensics, fresh eyes, an independent audit of everything Miami Metro believed, ignored, or conveniently filed away. In that frame, Season 2 stops looking like a daring escape and starts reading like a time bomb buried in a cardboard box of old evidence. To keep this clear, we take the same method that finally cornered Gary Ridgway and just apply it to Dexter's trail. Slow retesting, pattern analysis, a renewed look at every closed lead and every cop who was a little too close to the storm. On paper, the anomalies around Dexter are brutal. He is the blood spatter analyst assigned to the Bay Harbor butcher, while also being present at an uncanny number of related crime scenes. He is professionally and personally tied to James Dokes, the man posthumously blamed, and just happens to be the one who finds incriminating evidence and then survives a convenient cabin explosion that erases the only living suspect. Around him, suspects vanish, the informants die, and people like Lila appear just long enough to clean up the mess and disappear again. How does that cluster not light up in a modern data review? Compare that to Ridgway. The Green River killer was questioned, polygraphed, and then allowed to fade back into the population because the tools of the time couldn't nail him. When DNA technology caught up, investigators pulled old samples, reran tests, and suddenly, the man they had already outlived as a suspect snapped back into focus. The central question is simple. What happens when that same persistence is aimed at Dexter's meticulously staged chaos? Dexter's whole survival strategy in Season 2 is built on short-term disruption, explosions, frame jobs, last-minute substitutions of one body for another. It works in the moment because everyone around him is exhausted, traumatized, and eager for closure. But cold casework feeds on exactly that kind of rushed certainty. Every miraculous break becomes a red flag. Every too neat confession, every suspect who dies right on schedule, becomes a thread to pull when the politics have cooled off and the lab has better toys. In this video, we're going to keep stressing that tension between spectacle and procedure, because the focus is not just on whether Dexter can outthink one task force in 2007, but whether his entire trajectory could survive a system that keeps records and learns from its failures. The very drama that makes Season 2 so exciting, the fire, the framing, the romantic chaos, is exactly what would doom him in a Green River world. And here's the chilling part. If a real review team ever put Dexter Morgan's name back on the board, his biggest problem wouldn't be what they missed the first time. It would be what his own family life helped them finally see next. So if the family life helps investigators see Dexter more clearly, we need to pause and flip something we usually take for granted. We need to ask, what if Dexter's proudest safeguard is actually the clearest trail he leaves behind? Let's kick things off by spelling out that safeguard. Harry's Code gives Dexter 4 core rules. Only kill proven killers, never get caught, leave no trace, and follow a strict, repeatable ritual to keep his urges under control. Stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room, leave no evidence. On paper, it sounds like a plan for perfect control. In practice, it's a behavioral cage he keeps building higher around himself, because that ritual is not just habit, it's signature. Same types of victims, violent predators that intersect with his caseload or his personal life. Same method, drugged abduction, plastic-lined room, taped body, knife to the heart. Same disposal, wrapped parts, ocean dumps, or later, similarly concealed sites. The focus is not just on what he does in a single kill, but how relentlessly he repeats it. To a profiler, that is not noise. That is pattern. That is the central question that lights up a task force board. Who in this jurisdiction has the access, the knowledge, and the psychology to keep recreating this exact scene? Now, contrast that with Gary Ridgway. He operates in a fixed hunting ground around Pacific Highway South, targeting vulnerable women and sex workers. But his opportunism keeps everything muddy. Different dump sites, shifting clusters, bodies moved, scattered, revisited, years-long gaps between recoveries. He passes a polygraph in 1984 and just keeps going. It's chaotic enough that the investigation keeps fragmenting. Even as the body count climbs, Ridgway doesn't need a code. He needs a truck, free time, and a world that keeps overlooking the same kind of victim. Dexter is the opposite. He builds an elegant repeating machine, and every repetition tightens the evidentiary noose. Think about it from a cold case analyst perspective. Consistent victim profile, consistent kill method, consistent forensic precautions that all point to someone with formal training. That doesn't erase him. It narrows the search. Then there are the trophies. Ridgway keeps almost nothing that can be cleanly cataloged against him. Dexter, by contrast, creates the blood slides, a compact, labeled archive of his crimes, stored like a private forensic lab. Each slide is a confession. Each box is a ready-made indictment. If those ever land on a real review team's desk, the entire trajectory of the investigation changes overnight. The Bay Harbor Butcher case already proves this once. In a Green River world, that's not a near miss. That's game over. And here's where the pattern interrupt really lands. The very code Dexter believes will save him is what makes him legible. In this video, we're going to keep watching that inversion play out. Along the way, season by season, the same ritual that calms him will become the primary evidence that traps him until the code itself is the last thing left tightening around his throat. So when we step into season 3, that noose tightens in a new way. The failures stop being just about evidence and start being about intimacy. Dexter's need for connection becomes the actual crime scene. We open on the cleanest kind of disaster. He sticks a syringe into the wrong neck. An innocent man, Oscar Prado, drops because Dexter misreads the situation and rushes the plan. No code review, no confirmation, just the dark passenger on autopilot. Operationally, that's a straight-up collapse. But the investigation that follows doesn't come from Miami Metro. It walks in wearing an expensive suit and a grieving brother's smile. Assistant District Attorney Miguel Prado. To keep this clear, this is the first time Dexter's problem isn't just someone is close to my secret. Miguel isn't Dokes, sniffing around on instinct. Miguel is someone Dexter chooses to pull closer, not as a cover, as an experiment. What happens if he lets someone into the ritual itself? Miguel's appeal is obvious and poisonous. Power, because he's a high-profile prosecutor who can steer cases, bury leads, and weaponize the law. Protection, because having a DA in your corner feels like the ultimate insurance policy against exposure. And then the fantasy layered on top. If Miguel can learn the code, Dexter can finally share the burden and still stay in control. Isn't that the central question of Dexter's psychology in this season? Can he outsource the killing and keep the discipline? In this video, we're going to treat that relationship as Dexter's first major relational failure category. Harry, Brian, Lila. Those were about past, family, and survival. Miguel is about ego. Dexter believes he's the smarter predator, the architect who can draft a new version of the code and hand it down, like scripture without corrupting it. So he builds a plan. Use Miguel as a public shield, a political ally who can deflect heat and redirect investigations, while privately managing Miguel's darker impulses. Train him, test him, correct him. Dexter stalks the targets, confirms the victims, prepares the kill room. Miguel just becomes another tool, at least in Dexter's head. But notice the shift. The focus is not just on logistics anymore, it's on emotional validation. Dexter starts to enjoy being understood, being praised, being seen as a righteous force by someone who isn't Harry's ghost. That's the real exposure. Once the code becomes a bonding exercise instead of a containment system, how long can it pretend to be a safeguard at all? And this is where the comparison to Gary Ridgway turns brutal. The Green River Killer didn't need a confidant. He didn't recruit protégés, didn't chase emotional recognition, didn't build elaborate kill rooms to share with a friend. He had a truck, free time, and a hunting ground. Decades of killing with no Miguel, no Harry, no audience. Dexter, by contrast, can't resist turning murder into a relationship. Season 3 is where we watch that relational impulse become the next fault line and the next investigation, waiting to open under his feet. Dexter doesn't just let Miguel into his world. He drafts a syllabus. From the rooftop confrontation to that first plastic-wrapped kill room, we watch Dexter make a decision that Gary Ridgway never makes once. He chooses to teach. The plan is simple in his head. Take Miguel's rage, plug it into a curated version of the code, and turn a dangerous wildcard into a controlled outlet for violence he can supervise. To keep this clear, Dexter is not offering Miguel Harry's actual system. He's offering a stripped-down, weaponized demo. Dexter picks the target, stages the first kill, and walks Miguel through the ritual step by step. The photos on the wall, the confession, the knife placed in Miguel's hand at the exact right moment. The psychology here is textbook Dexter. If Miguel's first taste of murder is bound to Dexter's rules and Dexter's presence, then Miguel will feel dependent, loyal, and manageable. Dexter thinks he has safeguards, selective disclosure. Miguel hears about deserving it, but not about bloodslide, dumping grounds, or decades of practice. A staged first kill, an already vetted scumbag, a fully prepped room, every variable pre-controlled, and above all, the belief that Miguel needs him, that without Dexter's guidance, he wouldn't know who to kill, how to hide it, or how to live with it afterward. On paper, it looks like a closed system, but that's the collapse baked in from the start. The central question Dexter never asks is, what happens once Miguel realizes he doesn't need the teacher? The breaking point arrives fast. Miguel diverges from the code, hunts his own target, and kills not because of evidence or meticulous investigation, but because it feels good and useful. He skips the vetting. He skips the rules. He jumps straight to the power. We see the shift in his posture, his language, his confidence. Miguel starts bragging without saying he's bragging. He hints. He threatens. He treats the code as optional seasoning on something he now believes is his right. Dexter's illusion of control evaporates the second Miguel operates independently, because you cannot put a leash back on someone who has already killed and gotten away with it. At that point, Miguel isn't an outlet. He's a second, uncontrolled node of exposure. And this is where the comparison to real-world killers cuts through the fantasy. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to how often accomplices are the weak link. In case after case, the confidant talks, the follower flips, the partner leaves a trail. More people means more mouths, more egos, more points of failure. That's exactly why Ridgway never goes there. No proteges, no shared rituals, no one to impress. While Dexter is staging a mentorship, Ridgway is alone in a truck, picking up victims, killing quickly, and leaving bodies in wooded areas. His isolation is crude, but it works. It keeps the investigation chasing a ghost, while Dexter, in Season 3, manufactures his own liability. So what happens when that liability starts engineering his own plans? We watch Dexter do something that, on paper, looks decisive and controlled. He revises the mentorship into a termination. Miguel Prado stops being a project and becomes a problem to be solved. To keep this clear, Dexter's revised plan is simple in his head. Kill Miguel. Make it look like cartel payback or some external retaliation for his dirty dealings. No shared ritual, no poetic justice, just a pragmatic erasure of a high-profile assistant district attorney whose behavior is spiraling beyond the code. In Dexter's psychology, this is him regaining control, trimming the one branch that's growing wild so the rest of the tree can survive. But look at what that actually requires. He has to stalk a public figure with security, intercept him without witnesses, execute the kill, and then stage a scene convincing enough that every cop, every prosecutor, every politician in Miami buys the story. He has to trust that the investigation will accept a neat cartel narrative and not pull the thread of Miguel's last known confidant, the quiet, blood spatter guy who just happened to be everywhere Miguel was during this season's major cases. That's not a plan. That's a fantasy of invisibility. The focus is not just on the logistics of killing an ADA, but on the blast radius of what that death represents. In a real city, the murder of a prominent prosecutor doesn't get a shrug and a press conference. It triggers task forces. It pulls in federal agencies. It means joint briefings, political pressure, and a relentless dive into every corner of his life. Who did he prosecute? Who did he threaten? Who did he suddenly start spending late nights with? That is the central question any serious investigator would ask. Pattern interrupt for a second. Imagine Gary Ridgway in that position. Imagine the Green River Killer trying to operate under that level of scrutiny. He survived precisely because his victims were marginalized women along Pacific Highway South. People the system already failed. Their disappearances were easy to write off as transient, drug-related, or voluntary. There was horror, but there wasn't immediate political panic. That gap is everything. Ridgway could keep driving his truck, picking up victims, dumping bodies in woods and riverbanks, and the investigation kept chasing a ghost. Dexter, by contrast, keeps tying himself to people who generate headlines. A DA's brother, a rising ADA, cops, serial killers who make the news. Every time he upgrades his social circle, he upgrades the level of scrutiny that would follow any unexplained death. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this split. Ridgway's world kept him in the shadows. Dexter's choices drag him toward the spotlight. When your code has you killing the kind of man whose funeral would be televised, You are not operating in a Green River reality anymore. You're standing in the middle of a political crime scene, hoping no one notices the blood on your shoes. So when Miguel dies, what should that do to the trajectory of any real investigation? And how long could Dexter's illusion of control survive that blast radius? So when Miguel dies, the blast radius isn't just political, it's psychological. It exposes something Dexter keeps pretending is tactical, his need to be known. He doesn't bring Miguel into the code only because a high-powered ally is useful. He does it because, for the first time since Brian, someone looks at the monster and doesn't flinch. In this video, we're going to sit in that discomfort for a second. Dexter frames it as a plan. Train a killer. Aim him at the right targets. Maintain control. But the focus is not just on the logistics. It's on the hunger under the plan. Miguel sees the slides. Miguel hears the rules. Miguel stands in a kill room and calls Dexter brother. That's not strategy anymore. That's wish fulfillment. And the second it becomes wish fulfillment, Dexter's risk assessment collapses. He underestimates Miguel's ambition, assuming the code will restrain him the way it supposedly restrains Dexter. He overestimates Miguel's loyalty, trusting confessions and shared rituals over the very investigative instincts he uses on everyone else. He ignores warning signs that, in any real investigation, would be blaring sirens, escalation in victim choice, boundary testing, a sudden eagerness to improvise. To keep this clear, look at the contrast with Gary Ridgway. Ridgway's relationships were dysfunctional, controlling, often cruel, but he was not auditioning partners for his crimes. He didn't need a disciple in the passenger seat. His secrecy was blunt self-preservation, not a moral code, and definitely not a search for understanding. He passed a polygraph, kept killing for years, and never once tried to turn a friend into an accomplice, because he didn't need to be seen. He just needed to be left alone. Dexter is the opposite. The central question for him isn't only, how do I get away with this? It's, who can know me and still stay? Harry, Brian, Miguel, Lila, Lumen, Deb. Each season, the circle of people who glimpse the truth widens, and each time the consequences get worse. Each major section will show a new attempt to merge intimacy with homicide, and every attempt ends the same way: exposure, betrayal, or death. That's the real cost of wanting to be understood when your secret is serial murder. The double life is under constant internal pressure. The more Dexter wants to be known, the more he has to gamble on people who can absolutely destroy him. In a Green River reality, that's not romantic tragedy. That's an immediate operational failure. One Miguel Prado in Ridgway's orbit. One volatile ally with a grudge and a conscience that flickers on at the wrong moment, and the entire trajectory of the case changes. Season 3 is where we watch Dexter touch the stove and get burned, but then misread the lesson. He decides Miguel was the problem, not the desire for connection itself, and that sets us up for Season 4, where he tries to have it all: the code, a suburban family, and total control. Along the way, the comparison to Ridgway's mundane home life gets especially unsettling, because both men are changing diapers between murders, but only one is actively inviting the house of cards to collapse. So when we open Season 4 and see Dexter in a minivan, half asleep, juggling a crying baby and evidence samples, it feels like the joke version of his dream. But the series is dead serious. This is Dexter's peak fantasy of balance: the code, the career, the wife, the kids, the HOA. Nothing left to fix, just maintain control. And then Arthur Mitchell walks into the investigation. Let's kick things off with that first reveal. A mild, soft-spoken church deacon, gray hair, glasses, a man who builds houses with his charity group. On the surface, Arthur is everything society tells us is safe. A husband, a father, a fixture in the community. Underneath, he's the Trinity killer, a serial murderer who has been operating for decades without being caught. In this video, we're going to treat Arthur as what he really is in the show's psychology. Dexter's dark mirror, and the closest Dexter ever comes to asking the Green River question out loud. Because the central question of Season 4 is not just, can Dexter stop Trinity? It's, how does a killer hide in plain sight for this long? Dexter looks at Arthur and doesn't see a monster first. He sees a plan, a roadmap, proof that the double life can work if you're disciplined enough, if you're smart enough. To keep this clear, Dexter's new strategy is simple in his head. Study Trinity. Shadow his rituals. Learn the tricks that have kept him active through multiple investigations and changing forensic technology. Then import those tricks into his own life with Rita, Astor, Cody, and baby Harrison. Stalk the mentor. Extract the method. Upgrade the code. On paper, it's elegant. In practice, it's the most dangerous escalation in his entire trajectory. Because unlike his earlier seasons, Dexter is now fully embedded in suburbia. Backyard barbecues, school events, a house in a quiet neighborhood that looks almost interchangeable with the real cul-de-sacs Gary Ridgway drove home to after dumping bodies near the Green River. The show leans into that eerie overlap. Both men mowing lawns between murders, both framed as good with kids, both using domestic normalcy as camouflage. But here's the crucial divide. Ridgway survived through banality and being overlooked. Arthur survives through terrorizing his own family into silence and constantly moving his hunting grounds. Dexter thinks he can cherry-pick the longevity without absorbing the rot. The focus is not just on Arthur's methods, but on Dexter's response. He doesn't just investigate Trinity as a target. He apprentices himself to the fantasy that you can perfect this life. He takes Harrison to the Mitchell house. He watches Arthur play dad and thinks, this is sustainable. This is control. What we're going to break down next is how Trinity's routines stack up against Ridgway's real survival tactics, and why Dexter's attempt to copy Arthur doesn't just fail, it detonates his entire illusion of safety. Because the moment Dexter brings Trinity's model into his home, the countdown to Rita's death starts, and the gap between TV fantasy and Green River reality slams shut in the bloodiest way possible. The moment Dexter decides Trinity isn't just prey, but a mentor, the entire trajectory of the season shifts. He's not hunting Arthur Mitchell for justice. He's treating him like a living manual for how to kill forever without blowing up a family. So, let's kick things off with Dexter's intention. He embeds himself in Arthur's life, worms his way into that church build, into those breakfasts, into that suburban routine, because he believes Trinity has cracked the code he's been faking. Observe the ritual. Map the cycle. Extract a blueprint for sustainable murder inside a smiling household. In Dexter's mind, this is research, a controlled experiment in long-term survival. To keep this clear, Dexter thinks he has safeguards. He uses his job as cover, vanishing from Miami Metro under the pretext of forensics work and conferences. He compartmentalizes his lies. One story for Rita, one for Deb, one for his colleagues, and an entirely different identity for Arthur. He assumes that because he's navigated the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation and the Miguel Prado collapse, he can outthink a man who's been killing longer than Dexter has been an adult. The central question for him is almost arrogant. What trick does Arthur know that Harry never taught? But the breaking points start early. Dexter doesn't just watch Trinity's family. He gets pulled into their dysfunction. He misreads Arthur's rigid rituals as control instead of terror. A son beaten into submission. A daughter suffocating under religious shame. A wife living in permanent fear. The fantasy of the functional killer with a happy home dissolves, yet Dexter clings to it because his plan depends on it being real. Meanwhile, the lies to Rita stack up. Overnight trips, vanishing acts, manufactured stress about work. Every new visit to Trinity's world demands another layer of deception in his own, and the more he studies Arthur, the more he imports Arthur's instability into his marriage. This is the pattern we keep seeing in this video. The focus is not just on the kill, but on how every tactical decision corrodes Dexter's relationships. Now, contrast that with the Green River investigation. Real detectives did not have a neat cycle to decode or a plastic-wrapped ritual to photograph. They had bodies turning up in remote woods and riverbanks around Seattle and Tacoma from 1982 onward. They built the case slowly, linking victims by geography, by lifestyle, by the Pacific Highway South, revisiting suspects like Gary Ridgway over years. He was questioned, polygraphed in 1984, and still slipped away because the investigation was fragmented and the science wasn't there yet. Here's the pattern interrupt. Ridgway survived not by mastering a code, but by being ordinary. A truck, free time, quick kills, and dump sites. No theatrics, no kill rooms. When DNA finally caught him in 2001, it wasn't because someone studied his cycle like Dexter studies Trinity. It was because technology and persistence closed a decades-long gap. So while Trinity and Ridgway share surface similarities, middle-aged, religious veneer, long-term predation, Dexter's belief that he can simply learn the trick of survival from Arthur is itself a fatal miscalculation. Real predators thrive on being unremarkable, not ingenious. Dexter, by turning murder into a lifestyle design problem, makes himself visible. That's why this plan doesn't just fail. It accelerates the collapse that ends in that bathtub in season 4 and sets the stage for how every later attempt at control will echo this same delusion. In the next section, we're going to track exactly how that echo plays out once Rita is gone, and why the investigation into Trinity's crimes exposes Dexter more than it ever protects him. Rita in the bathtub. Harrison on the blood-soaked floor. Trinity's reflection in everything Dexter thought he could protect. This is the image cluster the whole suburban fantasy has been racing toward, and it exposes the ugliest truth about Dexter's grand plan. From the moment he moves into that house, Dexter is chasing one core fantasy, that he can run his life like a perfect double entry ledger. Killer at night, husband and father by day. Plastic-wrapped monsters in one column, birthday parties and barbecues in the other. To keep this clear, his psychology depends on that separation. The dark passenger is managed. The code is ethical. and as long as the two worlds never touch, he believes everyone he loves will be safe. Season 4 is where that illusion of control reaches its highest point and its sharpest collapse. Dexter studies Trinity, admires his apparent balance, and decides he can learn from him instead of eliminating him. That's the fatal misread. He underestimates the threat, delays the kill, keeps Trinity alive, so he can investigate the older man's methods like a twisted self-help seminar. Every extra day Trinity walks free is a day Dexter chooses the experiment over Rita and the kids. And then the ledger explodes. Dexter finally kills Trinity, feels the rush of a plan completed, and comes home to the nightmare he never calculated for. Rita murdered in his own ritual style, Harrison crying in a pool of her blood the way Dexter once cried in his mother's. The two columns merge. The code fails. The compartment walls come down. In this video, we're going to keep pressing on that collision because it's not just a plot twist. It's the one place the show brushes up against real-world collateral damage. Think about Gary Ridgway's family. His wives and his son lived in the same house, rode in the same truck, occupied the same quiet domestic spaces while he was dumping bodies along the Green River. They weren't co-conspirators, they were collateral. When the investigation finally caught him, their lives were permanently rerouted by a truth they never consented to. Dexter's story rhymes with that, but it also reveals a key distortion. The central question on screen is always, how will Dexter live with this? Rita's death centers his guilt, his grief, his fear that his trajectory is cursed. In real cases, the focus is not just on the killer's inner turmoil, but on the victims' families, on decades of trauma, on children who have to grow up with their father's face attached to a body count. So what does Rita's death actually prove? That Dexter's plans don't merely backfire on him, they radiate harm outward. Every attempt to manage two worlds manufactures new victims, new orphans, new people, forced to rebuild their identities around his secret. Along the way, the show gives us its clearest fictional warning. This kind of control is always a lie, and everyone orbiting the liar pays the price. In the next section, we'll track how that price keeps accruing after Rita, and why Dexter's later attempts at starting over only repeat the same catastrophe on a larger scale. And then, Season 4 rips the mask off. The fantasy of Dexter as protective husband and careful suburban planner ends in a bathtub full of blood and a baby sitting in it, crying. From the moment Rita's body is found, the show crosses a line that, in a real investigation, you never come back from. Police flood the crime scene. FBI profiles are updated. The official narrative locks in fast. A notorious serial killer, Trinity, targeted Dexter Morgan's family. We watch officers swarm his house, question his colleagues, comb through his timeline. On paper, Dexter is the victim. In practice, he is now permanently entangled with one of Miami's worst serial cases, and that entanglement has consequences that the show barely wants to look at. To keep this clear, think about how this works in reality. Your wife is murdered by a serial killer you were supposedly helping to hunt. You're a blood spatter analyst whose name is all over the case files. You vanish the night of the killing, return with a dazed story, and your infant son is found staged in a recreation of your own childhood trauma. Does that man ever go back to being just another guy at the lab? In a real system, Dexter becomes a permanent high-interest subject. Any future serial investigation in the region that brushes up against his cases, his crime scenes, or his personal orbit would light him up in databases and case conferences. Every transfer, every late night, every convenient insight would be reread through the lens of Rita's death. The central question for any competent investigator becomes, why does horror keep clustering around this one technician? This is where the comparison to Gary Ridgway is brutal. When Ridgway was finally arrested, his family and coworkers described a shock that instantly rewrote decades of memories. Suddenly, every unexplained late drive, every odd stain, every missing hour looked like a clue they had failed to see. The investigation did the same thing in reverse. Old reports, past interviews, a past polygraph in 1984, all reassembled into a portrait of a killer hiding in plain sight. Dexter should hit that same wall after season 4. From this moment on, any new serial case he touches would trigger that retroactive reread. Instead, the show lets him walk back into the bullpen, as if the emotional crater of Rita's murder doesn't also create a permanent investigative crater around him. His plan to blend in is already dead. The system should have him on the radar indefinitely. And yet, along the way, he responds in the only way he knows. He doubles down. More kills, more improvisation, more belief that the code and his control can still hold. What happens when that denial meets a world that keeps generating new Ritas, new Debs, new Harrisons? In the next phase of his trajectory, we watch the answer unfold, and it's even uglier than the bathtub. So let's kick things off by freezing Dexter right where we left him. At the end of season 4, blood on the bathroom floor. Rita murdered by another serial killer. A widowed father standing in the doorway, holding a crying Harrison who has literally been baptized in his mother's blood. Dexter is no longer just a quiet lab rat. He is a documented victim in a major homicide investigation tied to a nationally infamous case. On paper, he's also something else. A forensic insider who has been suspiciously adjacent to the ice truck killer, the Bay Harbor butcher, the Skinner, and now Trinity. His name is in reports, in interviews, and in press conferences. He has a dead wife, a traumatized child, and a work history that reads like a grist hits compilation of Miami's worst nightmares. This is the exact moment the fantasy of anonymity cracks, even if the show refuses to follow that trajectory all the way through. Now, pattern, interrupt. Take Dexter Morgan exactly as he is here and drop him into the Green River investigation at its peak. No palm trees, no Miami sun, just the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s and 90s, where bodies are turning up in woods and rivers, and a task force is drowning in evidence bags and failure. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this thought experiment, because the central question isn't just, is Dexter smarter than Gary Ridgway? It's, could Dexter's entire way of doing business survive an investigation built to remember him? At the height of the Green River case, you had dedicated local detectives, rotating commanders, FBI profilers, and eventually an expanding toolkit of forensics. Early DNA work, fiber analysis, database cross-referencing. The bureaucracy was messy, but the memory was long. Names stayed in binders. Patterns stayed on walls. To keep this clear, imagine every new body Dexter drops in that world. Every pattern of victimology. Every geographic cluster. Each one is automatically cross-checked against a task force that already knows him as a victim's husband, a coworker, a witness, a guy who keeps showing up on the edges of tragedy. How many times before someone asks, why is this blood spatter analyst always orbiting the worst crime scenes? Ridgway survived that exact environment precisely because he left so few narrative fingerprints. He was questioned. He was polygraphed. He was even an early suspect, then quietly downgraded because he passed a lie detector and lived a boring, blue-collar life that fit no cinematic profile. No code, no elaborate kill rooms, just a truck, isolated spots, and the brutal psychology of opportunism. Dexter, by contrast, cannot stop generating story. Elaborate plastic, trophies, dramatic confrontations, coworkers, and family woven into every investigation. The focus is not just on his kills, but on the consequences of needing his life to feel mythic. In a Green River level task force, that mythology is exactly what gets him noticed, which leaves an uncomfortable conclusion. Dexter's story only works because his world forgets, resets, and forgives. Ridgway's world remembered, just slowly enough to let him keep killing for decades. What happens when we finally put Dexter into a world that remembers at that scale? That's where the illusion of control really starts to collapse. So, when the world finally remembers, when investigations start to feel more like Green River than Bay Harbor, what does Dexter do? He doesn't pull back. He doubles down by trying to franchise the code. Season 5 is where that escalation snaps into focus. Dexter meets Lumen, a woman dragged through a torture ring and left for dead. And instead of turning her case over to the system, he makes a plan. He will help her hunt down every man who hurt her, stalk the targets, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room. Only this time, the ritual isn't just for him. It's a curriculum. On the surface, it looks almost noble. A survivor, a list of abusers, a meticulous avenger who knows exactly how to make bodies disappear. In this video, we're going to treat that as what it really is, a relational and existential failure disguised as progress. Dexter recasts his compulsion as medicine. Killing becomes healing, dismemberment becomes justice, and the code quietly shifts from a break to a brand. To keep this clear, watch how he talks to Lumen. He doesn't just say, "I'll take care of it." He explains the plastic, the knives, the rules about proof. He tries to turn trauma into a joint venture, a controlled vigilante partnership where he remains the architect. In his head, this preserves control on 3 fronts at once. He channels her rage, he manages the investigation risk, and he proves to himself that the dark passenger can serve something other than hunger. That's the plan. But the focus is not just on what he does for Lumen. It's on what he does to his own psychology. By inviting her into the kill room, he tells himself he's finally aligned his inner monster with another human being's needs. That feels like intimacy. It feels like purpose. It also obliterates the last thin line between "I have to do this" and "I choose to do this because it feels right." Once murder is framed as therapy, what boundary holds? This is also where the show leans hardest into the pure vigilante serial killer fantasy that real cases like the Green River Killer completely contradict. Dexter and Lumen build a neat, finite crusade, a defined group of offenders, a closed circle of victims, a season-long arc that promises emotional closure. In reality, as we've seen, Ridgway operated for decades with no code, no plastic, and no endgame. He wasn't crafting a narrative. He was exploiting gaps. So the central question becomes, what happens when we place Dexter and Lumen's surgical revenge fantasy next to the sprawling, messy, often unsatisfying way systems actually fail victims like Ridgway's? Along the way, we're going to see that the more Dexter tries to weaponize his code on someone else's behalf, the more his illusion of control sets him up for a much harsher comparison with the real world waiting outside Miami. So let's kick things off by actually looking at how Dexter and Lumen run their little war on the Barrel Girls crew, because the mechanics are seductive. They stalk, they verify, they build. In their world, justice is a project plan with plastic wrap. To keep this clear, Dexter's process with Lumen is almost ritualized. He helps her identify specific perpetrators from her captivity, cross-checks them against missing persons and crime scene data, then insists on physical proof before anyone gets on the table. A confession on tape, a trophy, a match between her trauma memories and his forensic investigation. Only then do we see the familiar choreography. A rented space, drains taped, walls wrapped, tools laid out in a neat grid. The code turns revenge into procedure. But the focus is not just on the kill rooms, it's on the strain required to keep them running. While he's architecting this vigilante partnership, Dexter is also raising a baby, pretending to grieve Rita, clocking in at Miami Metro, and managing a secret ally who is both emotionally shattered and tactically green. Lumen panics, improvises, follows impulses. Dexter keeps trying to fold her volatility into a controlled plan. That's not stability. That's a pressure cooker. Every time they close in on another man from the group, we watch Dexter stack responsibilities like unstable evidence boxes. Daytime, blood spatter reports. Deb breathing down his neck about the Barrel Girls investigation. Nighttime, teaching Lumen how to stalk without being seen, how to wield a knife without leaving traceable chaos. Fatherhood becomes a variable in the operation, not a separate life. This is sold as competence. Psychologically, it's a slow-motion collapse. Now, contrast that with what real survivors of serial violence face. There is no hyper-competent forensic avenger waiting in the wings. There are patrol officers who don't write up reports, detectives who doubt credibility, and families told to be patient while jurisdictional lines and budget constraints drag everything out. The central question becomes brutal. Who believes you, and how soon? For Ridgway's victims around the Green River, the answer was often no one, or not for years. In Dexter's Miami, a traumatized woman identifies her abusers, and within a single season, most of them are dead, their guilt confirmed, their bodies vanished. In the Pacific Northwest, families waited decades for a name. Ridgway was questioned, polygraphed, and then released back into the same hunting grounds. DNA advances finally cornered him. Not a code, not a plastic-wrapped room. Technology crawling forward while grief calcified. So the fantasy here is not just that Dexter survives, it's that violence, precisely aimed, can fix what systemic neglect and real killers like Ridgway destroy. One clean stab where the world offered only uncertainty. But what happens when we follow that fantasy to its logical endpoint and ask what it demands from everyone who is not on Dexter's table? So when we talk about that fantasy reaching its endpoint, Season 5 gives us the image in its purest form. A woman behind a wall, hearing a monster and never seeing his face. Dexter and Lumen in the warehouse. Deborah on the other side of the plastic, one pull of a sheet away from the entire story ending. Let's kick things off with that concrete moment. Inside, we have the full ritual. Victim wrapped, knives ready. Dexter mid-plan to purge Lumen's trauma and prove his code can be therapeutic. Outside, we have Deborah, gun drawn, voice steady, following an investigation that has led her right to her brother without her knowing it. The only separation between them is a translucent barrier and an emotional blind spot she has carried since childhood. To keep this clear, Dexter's control has never looked more theatrical or more fragile. His world now depends on two things: that Deborah cannot psychologically tolerate the idea that someone she loves could be like the men she hunts, and that she decides, in that instant, not to walk around the plastic and look. That's not a safeguard. That's a coin flip disguised as strategy. Compare that to Gary Ridgway's insulation. The Green River Killer's wife and co-workers were not spared because he was a meticulous mastermind with a code and a ritual. They were spared because he kept his killing life physically and socially separate. Different locations, different hours, different social circles. He hunted in the margins, truck routes, remote dump sites, vulnerable victims who had no overlap with his domestic life. No plastic curtain separated his worlds, because his worlds rarely touched. Dexter, by contrast, keeps dragging the people he cares about into the blast radius. Rita, Miguel, Lumen, Deborah. Each season, the trajectory bends closer to home. The focus is not just on operational failure, but on relational collapse. Every new confidant, every new partner, every new exception to the code turns the next operation into a potential unmasking. How many times can you invite someone into the kill room before the room stops being secret at all? In this video, we're going to keep returning to this pattern because the warehouse is the psychological turning point. Deborah doesn't see Dexter and Lumen, but she feels them. She talks through the plastic to two silhouettes she chooses not to identify, projecting her own justice fantasy onto strangers who are, in reality, her brother and his latest ally. That is not safety. That is borrowed time. And along the way, the contrast with Ridgway sharpens. His exposure comes late, through DNA and accumulated evidence, not through an emotional wall finally giving way. Dexter's wall is literally a sheet of plastic and a sister's Nile. We know it will break. The central question becomes, when it does, what collapses faster, Dexter's life or the myth that he was ever more secure than a real killer like Ridgway? That wall starts to crack in a church, under paintings of the apocalypse. Season 6 throws Dexter at the Doomsday Killer, and on the surface, it looks like just another elaborate case. Biblical tableaus, horsemen, bodies staged as prophetic warnings. But the real escalation is internal. Dexter isn't just hunting Travis Marshall, he's poking at faith itself, sneaking into Brother Sam's baptism, debating whether a killer can be saved, and testing if some higher plan might justify what he already does. The spectacle around him keeps pulling the investigation back toward one man who is always at the crime scene, always one step too close. From the mannequin at the fruit stand to the sword through the angel. Every tableau is an image of control, design, destiny. Dexter reads those signs as permission to keep believing his own story, that his code, his rituals, his plastic can coexist with being a father, a brother, a coworker. Yet, notice how the pattern repeats. The more he chases spiritual meaning, the sloppier his operational discipline becomes. He drags Harrison into the Nebraskan road trip of grief. He kills Travis on an altar. Deb walks in. The dark passenger literally collides with the last person still defending his innocence. To keep this clear, Season 6 is where the existential hunger really starts warping the risk calculus. Dexter isn't just satisfying an urge. He's auditioning worldviews. That's a luxury someone like Gary Ridgway never needed. Ridgway wasn't staging end times visions or interrogating his psychology in a church. He was picking up vulnerable women in his truck, killing fast, dumping bodies in woods and rivers, and going home. No shared philosophy, no ornate symbolism, no myth about being chosen, just repetition and neglect from the world around him. Then season 7 arrives and asks a different question. What if someone actually accepts Dexter? Enter Hannah McKay, a poisoner with a traumatic past, a confessed killer who doesn't flinch at what Dexter does. She offers him the one thing Rita, Lumen, and even Lila never could: the fantasy of a fully honest relationship built on shared murder. No more pretending, no more double life. Just two predators in a sunlit greenhouse talking about plants and bodies. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between what Dexter thinks he's controlling and what's actually happening. With Hannah, he tells himself he's found balance. In reality, every desire he's ever repressed, romantic connection, domestic comfort, a partner who gets him, starts overriding the code. He hides evidence for her. He lies to Deb to protect her. He lets a known killer walk because she makes him feel seen. How many red flags does he ignore because they fit the story he wants to live? Again, contrast that with Ridgway's life. He had marriages, a son, conflicts, but none of those bonds were forged through shared killing or philosophical debates about evil. His relationships were mundane, even banal, precisely because his crimes were compartmentalized, not ritualized into intimacy. By the end of season 7, the trajectory is obvious. Faith didn't save Dexter. Love didn't stabilize him. Both just gave him new reasons to rationalize greater risk. And when Deborah finally sees him with LaGuerta in that shipping container, gun shaking, we watch the last barrier between Dexter's two worlds disintegrate. The collapse isn't coming someday. It's here. The only question left is how far the consequences will spread and who gets pulled under next. Deborah in the shipping container, LaGuerta on her knees, Dexter with the knife. That image isn't just a climax. It's the moment every lie Dexter has ever told detonates at once. Let's kick things off with the raw discovery. Deborah doesn't piece it together from files or whispers in the squad room. She literally walks in as Dexter is about to execute their boss. Plastic, duct tape, the whole ritual. In one step, she moves from vague suspicion to full sensory confirmation. She hears LaGuerta beg. She sees Dexter choose. And when she fires the gun, killing LaGuerta to save him, the central question of their relationship flips forever. It's no longer, who is my brother? But, what have I just become? From that second on, Dexter's new plan is not about evidence or logistics. It's about Deborah's psychology. He pivots instantly, reassure her, normalize this, fold her into the code. He frames LaGuerta's death as a tragic necessity, then sells the idea that his killing is the same, a necessary evil, a private war that only looks monstrous from the outside. To keep this clear, Dexter stops trying to keep two worlds separate and starts trying to drag Deborah into the one he actually lives in. The focus is not just on what he does, but on what he needs her to believe. He needs her guilt to fuse with his secret. He needs her horror to reroute into protection. In practice, that means gaslighting by omission, emotional triage, and a constant low-level manipulation of her loyalty. Every conversation becomes part confession, part containment strategy. Every breakdown she has is both a threat and a resource he can exploit to keep the investigation away from him. Under real-world scrutiny, this is where the fantasy completely collapses. A high-ranking detective who has literally shot a victim to protect a serial killer brother, is not going to leave a subtle footprint. We would see erratic casework, inexplicable refusals to pursue leads, compromised reports, sudden transfers, and colleagues quietly flagging her behavior. Over time, that pattern would be traceable, especially in a Green River level investigation where multiple agencies and task forces cross-check each other's failures. Contrast that with Gary Ridgway. When the truth finally surfaced, there was no inner circle to manage, no Deborah to emotionally corral. There was DNA, victim matches, and a system that had stumbled for years, finally aligning around his guilt. Once the evidence locked, his world didn't hinge on whether one person emotionally collapsed or held it together. It hinged on lab results, interviews, and a charging decision. Dexter, from this point on, is the opposite. His survival is no longer anchored in his code, his forensics job, or his meticulous control. It's balanced on Deborah's unraveling. If she stabilizes, he's finished. If she confesses, he's finished. He is betting his entire trajectory on one person's ongoing breakdown. How many real killers could plan around that and expect to keep killing? And more importantly, what happens when the person you're leaning on to keep your secret decides the only way out is to burn everything down, including you? So Dexter does what collapsing men always do in this show. He reaches for an exit that doesn't exist. In season 7, that exit has a name, a passport, and a fantasy, Hannah McKay. The plan is simple in his head and wildly complex in reality. Fake a normal life. Leave Miami. Leave the blood-spatter job. Leave the code that has been both leash and license. Take Harrison, take Hannah, and outrun the mounting bodies like they're just bad memories and not active crime scenes. We watch him picture in almost suburban colors. No more kill rooms, no more slides, just a quiet house somewhere else and a woman who understands him. To keep this clear, Dexter is not just planning a move, he is planning a total personality transplant. The dark passenger will somehow behave itself on a family road trip. But the obstacles are already stacked higher than his evidence boxes. There are outstanding investigations, the Bay Harbor butcher files that never really die, Lagerta's suspicions still echoing through the department, the Koshka Brotherhood fallout, the Wayne Randall case. Deborah's turmoil is its own active crime scene. She is oscillating between covering for him, confronting him, and turning the gun on herself. How do you board a plane when your sister is one breakdown away from a confession? And then there's Hannah, a convicted poisoner with her own body count, her own investigations, her own fingerprints in multiple systems. She is not a clean slate. She is a walking, talking database hit. Along the way, the show pretends that a forged passport and some cash can erase a digital trail that includes arrest records, hospital files, and interagency notes. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this gap between what a plan feels like emotionally and what it would trigger procedurally. Because in reality, once a serial killer is on law enforcement's radar, geographic resets almost never stay clean. Names, vehicles, DNA profiles, prior interviews, even cleared suspects live in state and federal databases. You don't just cross a state line, you drag your entire investigative history behind you. Here's the pattern. Interrupt. The Green River Killer did the opposite of what Dexter thinks is smart. Gary Ridgway didn't flee. He stayed. Same region, same basic hunting grounds, around Seattle and Tacoma. Same forgettable truck, and forgettable life. He had already been questioned. He passed a polygraph in 1984 while actively killing. His survival wasn't about flamboyant reinvention. It was about institutional inertia and a personality so bland it slipped past the human radar. The central question, then, is whose strategy actually works in the real world. Dexter's escape fantasy is loud, fake identities, dramatic departures, a new life. Out there, Ridgway's survival reality is quiet, horrifying continuity. Keep going to work. Keep living in the same house. Let overworked detectives age out of the case. The focus is not just on who gets away longer, but on what each approach reveals about the psychology of control. Dexter needs to believe he can end his story on his terms. Ridgway never needed an ending at all, and that difference sets up the next collapse. What happens when Dexter finally tries to disappear for good, and the world refuses to let him stay gone? So when Dexter washes up in Miami again for season 8, he tells us he's found a way to live with the damage. The hurricane, the exile, Deborah killing LaGuerta, all of that is supposed to be behind him. But the second Dr. Evelyn Vogel walks into frame, the show quietly admits something else. Dexter's life was never his plan at all. Let's kick things off with the new pieces on the board. Vogel, the self-proclaimed creator of Dexter's Code. A fresh serial killer, the brain surgeon, carving out portions of victims' skulls. Deborah, no longer the relentless cop, but a private investigator, drowning herself in alcohol and guilt. From a barroom confession to a body in a storage container, every scene screams the same thing. The support structure that once kept Dexter functional is now actively disintegrating. To keep this clear, Season 8 retrofits the origin story. Harry isn't just a desperate father improvising rules. He's a collaborator in Vogel's clinical experiment in controlled psychopathy. The code stops looking like a moral anchor and starts reading like a lab protocol. Stalk the target. Confirm the victims. Prepare the kill room. It's not about ethics. It's about containment. And once we see that, the central question shifts. Was Dexter ever protecting people? Or was he just proving Vogel's theory that a monster could be domesticated? Operationally, his system is fraying. He misreads the brain surgeon, underestimates the danger to Vogel, and can't track Deborah because she's no longer predictable enough to surveil. Relationally, every bond is poisoned. Deborah alternates between wanting Dexter dead and needing him. Harrison is an abstract responsibility he keeps outsourcing, and even Vogel, the supposed architect, keeps her own secrets. Existentially, Dexter's fantasy of control collapses. If he's an experiment, what happens when the experiment is over? This is exactly where the Green River case becomes a brutal mirror. In the late 1990s, the investigation that had stalled for over a decade suddenly reanimated. Old evidence boxes were reopened, degraded samples were retested, and DNA technology finally caught up to Gary Ridgway's crimes. A man who had been questioned, polygraphed, and released in 1984 now faced a forensic reality he couldn't outtalk. Ridgway's long immunity ends not because he changes his behavior, but because the environment changes around him. The investigation tightens, the science advances, the same truck, the same hunting grounds, the same habits that once let him blend into the background now become a trail. That's the real-world version of what Season 8 is staging for Dexter, a world that no longer cooperates with the myth he's built about himself. In this video, we're going to track Dexter's final attempts at control against that inevitability. As Vogel's experiment unravels and Deborah's psyche deteriorates, Dexter keeps trying to script an exit on his terms. Along the way, we'll hold those fictional maneuvers up against the Green River investigation's slow, grinding certainty that eventually someone like Ridgway doesn't outsmart the system. He just runs out of time. So when Dexter decides he's going to protect Evelyn Vogel, he isn't just adding a side quest. He's rewriting the core fantasy of the code in real time, insisting it can still function as a shield, even as everything around it is clearly breaking. Vogel presents herself as the architect of his psychology, the one person who truly understands and validates his darkness. To Dexter, defending her from the brain surgeon isn't just a rescue mission, it's self-preservation. If Vogel dies, the last authority who can tell him he's not a monster dies with her. That's the intention. Guard the guardian, preserve the myth, keep control. But the way he goes about it drags him straight into another high-profile serial investigation with direct personal stakes. We're back in that familiar pattern. A named killer, a media circus, Miami Metro mobilized, and Dexter, supposedly the invisible predator, is now emotionally invested in the outcome. The focus is not just on catching a threat, it's on protecting the woman who designed his code, while hiding that connection from the people who investigate serial killers for a living. To keep this clear, watch how every protective move generates a new anomaly. He runs his own off-book investigation, siphoning case details from the lab and from Deb, then pursuing leads alone. He confronts suspects without backup, stages his own crime scenes, and withholds key information from both Vogel and the department. Each choice is meant to minimize risk. Each one leaves a procedural scar. Why was Dexter at that house? Why did the suspect vanish right after he took an interest? Why is evidence missing or misdirected whenever the brain surgeon gets close to Vogel? From a distance, it looks like control. Up close, it's a trail. A forensic breadcrumb path that only works because the show's world bends around him. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap between what the plan promises and what it would actually produce in a real investigation. Now, contrast this with Gary Ridgway's final years before arrest. No dramatic confrontations with a nemesis. No escalating theatrics to defend a surrogate parent. Just a man in a truck picking up vulnerable women around Pacific Highway South, killing quickly, dumping bodies in woods and rivers, and then going back to work. The investigation grinds on in the background while he passes a polygraph, survives multiple interviews, and simply blends into the statistical noise until DNA technology catches up. That banality is exactly why he lasted. No code, no confidants, no high-stakes relationships that force him to dramatize his own story. Dexter, by contrast, keeps engineering situations where he must perform his identity as ethical killer, son, protege. That performance accelerates his exposure. It collapses the boundary between his job, his secret life, and his supposed safeguards. The central question becomes unavoidable. If every attempt to protect the code turns into a louder signal for any competent task force, what happens when Dexter tries to protect someone even closer than Vogel? So, when Dexter finally tries to protect someone closer than Vogel, the plan he lands on feels almost poetic to him. A storm, a sacrifice, a vanishing act. In the season 8 finale, Dexter's last Miami plan is brutally simple in his own mind. Put Harrison on a plane with Hannah. steer Deb's body into the hurricane, stage his own death at sea, and disappear so the darkness can't hurt anyone else. On screen, it plays as tragic self-awareness, the boat slipping into the churning water, the debris washing ashore. The news reports mourning a fallen blood spatter analyst. In Dexter's psychology, this is the ultimate act of control. He chooses the moment. He writes the ending. He believes the code has finally evolved into self-punishment. But step outside the montage for half a second and the logistics collapse. In this video, we're going to treat that hurricane exit the way any real investigation would. A high-profile Miami Metro employee vanishes during a storm, with a long history of proximity to major homicide cases, and nobody pulls at the threads? No missing person case that lingers? No insurance questions about a boat, a life policy, a pension? No one in HR wondering why their star analyst never files a single form, never has a body recovered, never leaves a clean paper trail? To keep this clear, imagine that exact scenario unfolding around someone like Gary Ridgway. Ridgway didn't get a romantic storm. He got DNA matches, an arrest in 2001, and a grinding legal process. He confessed to dozens of murders, took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, and now lives out a life sentence in a concrete box. No fake death, no lumberjack exile, just institutional containment and a permanent record that doesn't care about his inner narrative. That's the real-world baseline Dexter's hurricane fantasy cannot survive. Ridgway slipped multiple investigations for years, passed a polygraph, and still ended in handcuffs because systems kept circling back. Dexter, by contrast, sails into a storm, and the universe politely accepts his resignation. The focus is not just on plausibility, it's on agency. Ridgway's fate is imposed on him. Dexter's finale insists he still picks his own punishment. And that's the tell. The lumberjack exile is less about realism and more about preserving the fantasy that Dexter's trajectory remains self-authored. He doesn't go to trial. He doesn't sit through victims' families' statements. He doesn't become a case file in someone else's control. He punishes himself, but only in a way that keeps the myth alive, the cursed man who could come back at any time. Pattern interrupt. What if he does? New Blood is built on that question. What happens when a man who should be either caught or dead tries to start over anyway? Each major section will show how Iron Lake exposes the hurricane exit for what it always was. Not closure, but a delay. Not accountability, but yet another plan waiting to fail in the cold light of a new investigation. New Blood answers that delay with a lie that looks, at first glance, remarkably stable. Snow-covered woods, a tiny shop, a man who calls himself Jim Lindsay, selling guns and bait to hunters, and pretending his hands are clean. On the surface, this is Dexter's most disciplined plan yet. No kills, no slides, no plastic. Just routine, isolation, and a fantasy of control built on abstinence. We watch him clock in, joke lightly with coworkers, and go home to an empty cabin where the knives stay in the kitchen drawer. He runs, he dates, he submits to small-town rituals. The code has been stripped down to a single commandment: do not kill. To keep this clear, New Blood opens as if the entire previous trajectory has been reduced to a behavioral experiment. Can the dark passenger be starved into silence if the environment is quiet enough? But Iron Lake is not actually quiet. It's a closed ecosystem. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone notices the man who doesn't quite fit. Gossip does the work of a task force. The investigation never looks like Miami Metro, but the scrutiny is constant, horizontal, and social. A missing deer, a rich kid, an outsider with a secret past. This town turns rumor into pressure long before it turns into evidence. Into that pressure walks Harrison. The central question of New Blood is not just whether Dexter can resist killing, but whether he can resist turning his son into a new version of himself. Harrison's arrival detonates the illusion of a clean slate. Suddenly, Dexter wants to confess, to explain the code, to repurpose all those years of failure into a twisted inheritance. Is he protecting his son or recruiting him? We can feel the psychology repeat. Harry tried to manage a boy's urges with rules and training. Now, Dexter tries to manage Harrison's trauma with the same broken toolkit. Along the way, he's juggling another killer in town, a community on edge, and his own resurfacing compulsions. The plan is to control all three vectors at once, guide Harrison, eliminate threats, and maintain the Jim Lindsay mask under increasingly claustrophobic scrutiny. And this is where New Blood quietly echoes the real world in a way the Miami seasons rarely did. Gary Ridgway's legacy is not cinematic. It's a son who had to learn his father was one of the most prolific killers in American history, and families who spent decades trapped in an open-ended investigation that kept circling the right man and failing to stop him. There is no code there, only the slow, grinding aftermath of hidden violence. Dexter imagines he can script a different ending. Train Harrison, clean up Iron Lake, disappear again, if needed. But the trajectory of his life has never rewarded that fantasy. New Blood positions his final plan as a stress test, and the collapse that's coming will look less like a master escaping and more like a belated justice his world has been dodging since the first blood slide. In this video, we're going to follow that collapse all the way down. And at the bottom of that collapse, Dexter makes one last plan. If he can't escape alone, he'll escape with Harrison. Not just physically, but psychologically. He decides his legacy isn't the bodies, it's the worldview he can pass on. Let's kick things off with what Dexter actually thinks he's doing in New Blood. He doesn't dump the whole truth on Harrison in one confession. He stages it. First, hints about anger. Then, disclosures about his own urges. Finally, the reveal of the code as a kind of moral technology, a set of rules that supposedly turns compulsion into justice, chaos into control. In his mind, this is a father-son alliance forming in real time. Two survivors of trauma, finally speaking the same language. To keep this clear, we need to step into Dexter's psychology. He imagines safeguards everywhere, radical honesty, so there are no more secrets like Harry's, shared rules, so Harrison never has to feel alone with his darkness. A belief that the blood-soaked origin they share makes Harrison uniquely capable of understanding what no one else ever could. Dexter is convinced that if anyone can handle the truth about the code, it's the baby who watched their mother die in blood, now grown into a teenager searching for meaning. But when he finally walks Harrison through the logic, it doesn't land as wisdom. It lands as horror. Harrison doesn't hear, "I only kill bad people." He hears a man rationalizing murder, smoothing over victims with vocabulary. He pushes back on the central question Dexter keeps dodging. Who gave you the right? Harrison rejects the code, not because he's too fragile, but because he sees the failure at its core. Killing isn't therapy. Killing isn't healing. Killing, even of killers, leaves more wreckage. The focus is not just on their argument, it's on the contrast with how real children of serial killers encounter the same abyss. Gary Ridgway's son doesn't get a guided tour of his father's darkness. There is no late-night drive where the Green River Killer explains his rules. Instead, the truth arrives from the outside. News reports, court documents, victim counts stacking up in headlines, and a legal system naming his father a predator. The investigation, the trials, the media coverage, all build a narrative Ridgway never controls. His son has to assemble his father's reality from fragments, not from a curated confession. Dexter believes he can do better. He thinks that by scripting the reveal, by managing the story, he can manage the consequences. But that's the final relational failure. He still imagines his legacy as a plan. Harrison refuses the role. Reality refuses the script. And once Harrison stops cooperating, Dexter's control fantasy meets something he's never been able to plastic wrap. Because what happens when the person you're trying to induct into your myth decides the investigation isn't over, it's just beginning? Harrison doesn't buy the myth. And once he starts treating Dexter like a suspect instead of a mentor, the story snaps back into something closer to reality. The investigation isn't just emotional anymore, it's tactical. So, when Dexter lands in that Iron Lake jail cell, we're not just watching a setback. We're watching the last desperate version of his plan for control. Dexter's trapped. Angela has real evidence. Harrison is slipping away. For once, the walls aren't theoretical. They're cinder block and steel. To keep this clear, this is not one of those early season inconveniences where a quick lie or a forged report resets the board. His only way to reach Harrison now is escape. Fast, messy. And the man between him and the exit is Officer Logan. We see the entire collapse in a few brutal seconds. Dexter calls Logan over, fakes a neck injury, grabs him through the bars, chokes him with the handcuffs, slams his head into the metal until the body goes limp. No plastic, no ritual, no confirmation of guilt. Just improvised violence in a holding cell with cameras, witnesses nearby, and a direct line from motive to method. This is the purest violation of the code we've ever seen. Logan is innocent. Logan is a father. Logan is not a killer who slipped through the system. Dexter kills him because he is inconvenient, because he is in the way of the next step in the plan. The central question that haunted the series, whether the code was ever real morality or just a story Dexter told himself, gets its answer right here on that concrete floor. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this moment because it's where the psychology finally matches the reality. Dexter always claimed he was different from the chaotic, opportunistic predators he hunted. Yet, this is chaos. This is opportunism. This is a cornered animal taking the quickest road out, leaving an obvious trail of evidence and a dead cop on the ground. And that's where the Green River comparison cuts through the fantasy. Gary Ridgway never pretended to have a code. He prowled highways, picked up vulnerable women, killed quickly, and dumped bodies in woods and rivers. No higher purpose, no elaborate ritual, just repetition and availability. Ridgway was questioned, polygraphed, even flagged in the investigation, and he still kept killing because he blended into the ordinary. Dexter has spent 8 seasons and a New Blood epilogue insisting he is not that. Yet, with Logan, he finally becomes exactly that, a man killing the easiest target to preserve himself. The focus is not just on the act, but on how nakedly it exposes his self-flattering fiction. Pattern interrupt. What if this is the only truly honest kill Dexter ever commits, because it strips away every excuse? No Harry, no code, no vigilante script, just consequences. Which is why the next step matters. Logan's death doesn't save Dexter's trajectory. It destroys the last illusion Harrison could cling to. The final confrontation we're heading toward isn't another hunt. It's the only real accountability Dexter Morgan will ever face, delivered not by a task force or a court, but by the son he tried to recruit into his collapsing myth. Harrison, standing over Dexter in that snowy clearing, is the anti-kill room. No plastic, no tools, no ritual. Just a rifle, a broken father, and a son who has finally seen the plan for what it is. A trail of bodies dressed up as protection. Dexter, bleeding and cornered, does something he spent an entire series avoiding. He tells the truth. He admits Logan's death wasn't an accident, wasn't necessary, wasn't the code. It was him, his need, his failure of control. And then he does the one thing he's always denied his victims. He asks for it. He tells Harrison to shoot. In that moment, the show collapses years of evasion into a single, emotionally charged decision. No investigation, no trial, no Bay Harbor butcher, task force, finally connecting the slides, the boats, the missing suspects. One bullet is allowed to stand in for every body on Dexter's table, every life detonated by his presence. It feels clean. It feels like justice compressed into a single frame. To keep this clear, what we're watching is a narrative shortcut. The focus is not just on a father dying, it's on a story choosing catharsis over process. Harrison pulls the trigger, and the series can claim a reckoning without showing us the grind that real accountability demands. No appeals, no evidence hearings, no decades of families reopening wounds every time a new detail surfaces. Now, hold that against Gary Ridgway's ending. No snowy field, no tearful confession to a single loved one. Instead, a courtroom packed with families, prosecutors, detectives who have spent years in the wreckage. Ridgway's trajectory toward a life sentence is slow, bureaucratic, relentlessly public. Negotiations over the death penalty, bargains for more confessions, victim impact statements that do not heal anything, but insist the harm be named again and again. Ridgway didn't get a single cinematic moment where everything collapses into one choice. His endgame is paperwork, chains, fluorescent lights, and a body aging in a cell while the consequences of his actions keep rippling outward. It is messy, collective work. It is the opposite of a clean cut. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between Dexter's fantasy of control and the reality of real-world justice. Because while Dexter's death feels satisfying, it also lets us skip the hardest parts, the investigations that stall, the families who never get answers, the communities that have to live with the fact that their institutions failed them for years. So, the central question becomes, is Dexter dying by Harrison's hand a true reckoning, or just one last attempt to author his own ending? He chooses the time. He chooses the place. He even scripts Harrison's escape. Along the way, the series tempts us to accept that as closure. But compared to a Ridgway life sentence, it looks less like justice and more like Dexter's final illusion of control. And if that's the case, what does it say about us that this is the version of justice we find most satisfying? So, if Dexter's chosen ending already looks flimsy next to a real-life sentence, we need to zoom out even further. Not just to the finale, but to the entire trajectory of his life, and how every category of failure keeps looping back on the same myth of control. To keep this clear, we've been tracking 3 layers: operational, relational, existential. On paper, they're separate. In practice, they're welded together. A missed detail in an investigation doesn't stay technical for long. It bleeds into relationships, which then expose the lie at the center of Dexter's psychology. Take the body dump discovery. From a concrete image of divers hauling up trash bags to Masuka reading trace evidence in the lab, we watch an operational failure explode. The ocean, Dexter's supposedly perfect graveyard, turns into a crime scene. That forces a task force, which forces patterns, which forces the Bay Harbor butcher narrative into existence. His job, his rituals, his code, all the things he thought gave him control become a map straight back to him. To survive that, he frames Dokes. Operationally, the plan works, but it requires Lila burning a man alive, requires Dexter letting an innocent cop die as his scapegoat, and requires Deborah grieving the partner she trusted most. The cover-up is relational napalm, and it deepens the existential lie. If the code keeps him alive, then any sacrifice is justified, including people who never touched his table. From there, every season is another turn of the same screw. Rita's death is the relational bill for his operational secret life with Trinity. Deborah, learning the truth in that church, is the moment the lie about his own nature finally hits someone who loves him. Logan's murder in New Blood is the end game, a desperate, sloppy act that shatters Harrison's belief in the myth of the righteous killer. Stalk the target, prepare the kill room, protect the family. By the time we reach Iron Lake, each step in that 3-part plan guarantees the opposite outcome. Now hold that against the Green River Killer timeline. Gary Ridgway isn't running elaborate tables, no plastic wrap, no trophies, just a truck, isolated stretches near the Green River, and victims the system already treated as disposable. He's questioned. He's an early suspect. He even takes a polygraph in 1984 and passes while he's still actively killing. The investigation fails, not because he's a mastermind, but because the technology is limited, the victims are marginalized, and the follow-through fractures over years. Ridgway survives because systems collapse around him until DNA finally catches up and locks him into a real, public, permanent consequence. Dexter survives for as long as he does because the narrative keeps rewarding his belief that planning equals control. That's the core irony. He thinks he's still here because of his code. Ridgway was still here because the world looked away. In this video, we're going to argue that once you watch Dexter as a failure reel instead of a power fantasy, the show curdles into a cautionary tale about believing your own myth. But if that's true, what does it mean for every other brilliant monster story we've been trained to root for? So let's kick things off by asking the central question the show keeps dancing around but never quite answers. If we strip away the voiceover, the orange juice, the stylized plastic kill rooms, was Dexter ever actually in control? Or was he just surfing chaos, staying upright because the wave didn't break yet? Think about the moments where his plan should have ended everything. James Dokes doesn't die because Dexter outsmarts him. Dokes dies because Lila shows up at a cabin Dexter abandoned and blows it sky high. One explosion, one arson, one addict with a fixation. Dexter walks away from the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, not as a mastermind, but as the beneficiary of someone else's crime. The code didn't save him there. Dumb luck and someone more unhinged did. Same pattern at the docks with Deborah and Lagerda on the plastic. Dexter spends an entire season engineering control over the investigation, framing Hannah, gaslighting Deb. It still comes down to a gun, a warehouse, and Deborah making a split-second choice she can never unmake. He doesn't outplan LaGuerta. He survives because his sister can't pull the trigger on him. The kill room looks precise. The psychology underneath is pure improvisation. Storms, too. A literal hurricane lets him fake his death and vanish to Oregon. Convenient power outages, conveniently timed bodies discovered by the wrong people, convenient accidents that erase evidence. Over and over, we watch a man who believes he's the architect of his fate get bailed out. By coincidence, other people's sacrifices, and institutional failure. To keep this clear, the failures aren't rare spikes in an otherwise controlled trajectory. They are the operating system. Now put that next to Gary Ridgway. No voiceover, no code, no ritual plastic. Just a man with a truck, free time, and a victim profile the world didn't protect. From 1982 to the late 1990s, Ridgway kills around Seattle and Tacoma, targeting vulnerable women near Pacific Highway South. He gets questioned. He gets polygraphed in 1984 and passes while he's already a suspect. The investigation brushes him, then drifts away. He isn't Dexter's fantasy of a brilliant predator. He's an ordinary man operating inside a system with a deadly margin for error. That's the uncomfortable mirror. Dexter plans and still collapses. Ridgway barely plans and still succeeds until DNA technology and better coordination finally catch up. One story shows the myth of control failing in a curated universe built to flatter it. The other shows the myth exposed by reality, where control often just means, no one stopped me yet. So, what are we actually drawn to? The fantasy of the perfect predator, or the bleak truth that ordinary, mediocre evil can thrive when environment, era, and institutions leave the door open? Along the way, Dexter lets us pretend control is an art form. Ridgway forces us to ask whether control was ever really there in the first place, or just a story we tell, so the chaos feels less random. So, when we stack Dexter Morgan against the Green River Killer, we're not really watching a duel. We're watching two different universes collide, one built to bend around a protagonist's plan, and one that let a very ordinary predator move through its blind spots for nearly 2 decades. Dexter exists in a narrative that will let him almost fail spectacularly, over and over, but never quite tip the final domino until the writers are ready. Ridgway existed in a world where institutions, technology, and prejudice failed first, and he simply kept walking through the gaps. The central question stops being who would win in a hunt and becomes, what does it take to keep getting away with murder? To keep this clear, we can trace Dexter's trajectory through the same lens we've used all video. Early on, his operational slips are already fatal in a Green River level investigation. The blood slides, the boat, the consistent dump sites. In a real task force environment, those are not quirks of personality. They're pattern generators. Ridgway, by contrast, used no plastic wrap, no trophies, no theatrics. He picked up women in his truck, killed quickly, and left bodies in woods and ravines. Low ritual, low visibility, low narrative flair, but also lower forensic coherence. By the middle seasons, Dexter's relational disasters would have detonated any real investigation around him. Dokes locking onto him on instinct, Lila blowing up cabins and burning evidence, Miguel Prado spiraling into his own killings. Each major section will show us another person who either suspects Dexter, partners with him, or dies because of him. Every one of those connections is a potential witness, a leak, a rumor. Ridgway's life looks almost boring by comparison. A marriage, a job, a quiet presence who could pass a polygraph and then go right back to dumping bodies off Pacific Highway South. Late stage, Dexter's existential collapse in Miami, and then Iron Lake is drenched in exposure. Deb walking into the church. Lagerta in the shipping container. Harrison on the snowy road. The code, the family fantasy, the new identity in New Blood. Each attempt at control multiplies evidence, relationships, and investigations. Ridgway's code was absence. No speeches, no moral frame, no self-mythology. That vacuum, combined with weak coordination and slow DNA advances, is what kept him free until 2001. And we need to say this plainly. None of this is about glorifying Ridgway. The focus is not just on his body count or Dexter's creativity. It's about puncturing the glamorous psychology we wrap around killers like Dexter to make the chaos feel like a chess match instead of a systems failure. In this video, we're going to keep closing that loop, because once you put Dexter and the Green River Killer side by side, the real question isn't who would win. It's why did we ever believe Dexter's way could work outside television at all? So now that we've pulled Dexter off his Miami soundstage and dropped him next to the Green River investigation, we're left with a harder, more uncomfortable question. What do we actually do with these killer myths we keep watching, quoting, and defending? Let's kick things off by handing the thought experiment to you. In a Green River style investigation with decades of missed chances, evolving forensics, and a task force that never really goes away, how many seasons do we honestly think Dexter would last before the collapse? 2? 1? Half a season? Arrested the moment those blood slides hit an evidence locker. The central question isn't just, could he catch Ridgway, but how long before Dexter's own pattern turned him into the easiest suspect on the board? To keep this clear, think back through his trajectory and weigh it out in the comments. Does Bay Harbor butcher Dexter survive a real multi-agency investigation when his co-workers are literally mapping his dump sites? Does Miguel season Dexter with a wildly uncontrolled apprentice make it past episode 3? Does Trinity season Dexter juggling a family fantasy and a serial killer rival implode instantly under Green River level scrutiny? Or is it Deborah season Dexter, or New Blood Dexter, in Iron Lake, whose plan feels the most delusional once we've seen how Ridgway actually slipped repeated interviews, a failed polygraph system, and a changing forensic landscape for almost 20 years. Along the way, we've been stress testing Dexter's code against Ridgway's reality. Now we want your verdict. Drop a comment with the one Dexter plan that in hindsight feels the most like pure television psychology. Bay Harbor, Miguel, Trinity, Deborah, or New Blood. Which version of Dexter's control collapses first the moment we plug him into a case file instead of a writer's room? We also want to keep expanding this investigation. If Dexter versus the Green River Killer exposed one gap between fantasy and reality, What comparisons should we run next? Other real cases to stack against his methods. BTK, the Night Stalker, the Long Island serial case, or other fictional killers whose myths need stress testing. Hannibal Lecter's aesthetic precision, Joe from You and his surveillance fantasies, Villanelle's globe-trotting chaos. Tell us which stories you want put under the same pressure. But as we do that, we need to ground this in something heavier than plot mechanics. Gary Ridgway is not a character. His victims were not arcs. If this episode stirred something, take time with sources that center the women he targeted and the communities he tore through. Documentaries and books that sit with their names, their families, and the system that failed them, not just Ridgway's confessions. In this video, we're going to keep closing that gap between Dexter's fantasy and Ridgway's reality, because that's where the real stakes are. The more clearly we see how far the show is from the case, the better we get at spotting and refusing the comforting lies our stories tell us about evil, control, and what a monster really looks like. So, tell us below, how many seasons does Dexter actually last? Which plan breaks first? And which myth do we dismantle next?